Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first laugh came at 3:47 a.m., precise as a blade through silence. I'd been awake for hours already, watching October rain streak down the windows of my 10th floor apartment, creating rivers of distortion against the Chicago skyline. The building, a pre-war relic with bones of steel and memories of limestone, had its own vocabulary of sounds. Pipes that sang hymns at midnight, radiators that clicked out Morse code messages I couldn't decode. But this was different. This was intentional. The giggle started soft, like a child suppressing joy at a funeral, then cascaded into something sharper, more metallic. It resonated through the walls themselves, as if the plaster had grown vocal cords. I pressed my ear against the door, and the sound seemed to press back, vibrating through my skull until my teeth ached. My hand found the doorknob before my mind could object. The brass was ice cold, burning my palm with its chill. As I turned it, ready to confront whatever waited in that dimly lit hallway, the air itself became thick as molasses. An invisible weight slammed into my chest, driving me backward across the living room until I crashed into the coffee table. My lungs fought for breath against pressure that shouldn't exist, like being 30 feet underwater in my own apartment. The laughter stopped. I stayed on the floor for what felt like hours but was probably minutes, waiting for my heart to remember its rhythm. The apartment's silence was worse than the sound, expectant, watchful. When I finally stood, my legs trembling like a newborn colt's, I noticed the intercom screen by the door flickering with static. Through the electronic snow, letters formed. Aquí, here. The Spanish word burned itself into my retinas even after I looked away. I'd studied the language in college, knew enough to recognize it. But why Spanish? Why now? The screen went dark, then lit again with the same message, pulsing like a heartbeat. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual for this building with its thick walls and ancient infrastructure, but the timing felt deliberate. The landline had been disconnected months ago when I'd decided to save $40 a month. Stupid economy, stupid decision. The hallway lights visible through the peephole began their performance then. One by one, starting from the far end near the elevator, they extinguished themselves in sequence. A wave of darkness rolling toward my door, then stopping just before reaching it. They'd flicker back on, and the pattern would repeat. An invitation, a warning, both. I backed away from the door until my shoulders hit the far wall. The apartment was a simple one-bedroom, 900 square feet that usually felt spacious enough. Now it compressed around me like a closing fist. The ceiling began its symphony. Footsteps that couldn't be footsteps because Mrs. Chen lived above me, and she'd been in Shanghai for 3 weeks visiting family. I'd been watering her plants. The sound was too deliberate anyway, too synchronized with my own movements. When I stepped left, it stepped left. When I froze, it froze. The temperature plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows. October in Chicago was cold, but not February in Alaska cold. The radiator hissed and clanged in protest, fighting against the impossible chill. I tried to think rationally. Carbon monoxide leak? But I had detectors, and they weren't screaming. Hallucinations from lack of sleep? I'd been sleeping fine until tonight. Mental breakdown. My therapist had said I was making progress with the anxiety, that moving to a new city for the job had been a positive step. The job. I'd been in Chicago for 4 months now, working as a systems analyst for a company that managed data for other companies that managed data. Layers upon layers of abstraction, until nobody knew what anyone actually did anymore. The work was mind-numbing, but paid well enough for this apartment in Lincoln Park, close enough to downtown, but far enough to avoid the tourist chaos. Another laugh, this time from inside the apartment, from the bedroom. My bedroom door was closed. I always left it open, a childhood habit that followed me into adulthood. Closed spaces made me nervous, but there it was, shut tight, with light bleeding out from underneath. Not my lamp's warm yellow glow, but something colder, bluer, like the light from old computer monitors or dying fluorescent bulbs. The doorknob turned on its own, slowly, testing. I grabbed a kitchen knife, knowing how absurd it was. What was I going to do? Stab a sound? Cut the air that pushed me? But the weight of it in my hand was comforting. A tangible thing in a night that had abandoned the rules of tangibility. The bedroom door swung open to reveal nothing. My room exactly as I'd left it. Bed unmade, laptop on the desk, yesterday's clothes draped over the chair. But the shadows were wrong. They fell in directions that defied the single light source, creating geometries that hurt to perceive directly. The intercom buzzed. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. New message. Ariba. Above. The ceiling footsteps intensified, no longer matching my movements but dancing their own frenetic pattern. Dust drifted down like snow, and I could swear I saw the drywall beginning to crack. Whatever was up there wanted in, or wanted me to know it could come in whenever it chose. I made for the front door again, determined to push through whatever force had stopped me before. This time nothing pushed back. The door opened easily, revealing the hallway in complete darkness except for the exit sign at the far end, glowing like a distant red star. I stepped out, and immediately the lights blazed back to life, so bright they made my eyes water. The hallway stretched longer than it should. I'd walked it hundreds of times. 20 steps to the elevator, 15 to the stairwell. Now it seemed to extend infinitely, doors multiplying like cells dividing. Some were familiar. Mr. Peterson's with the Cubs doormat, the young couple in 10C with their collection of shoes outside. But others were wrong. Doors that opened onto brick walls, doors with no handles, doors that seemed to breathe. Behind me, my apartment door slammed shut. When I turned back, it wasn't there anymore. Just smooth wall where it should have been. My hand searched frantically for any seam, any indication of where I'd emerged, but found only cold plaster. The laughter returned, now from every direction, not just one voice but dozens, harmonizing in frequencies that made my stomach churn. The floor began to tilt, or maybe I was tilting. Hard to tell when every reference point had decided to rebel against Euclidean geometry. I ran toward the exit sign, but it maintained its distance no matter how fast I moved. Like running on a treadmill, all effort, no progress. Other doors began opening as I passed. Not fully, just cracks wide enough for eyes to peer through. Eyes that reflected too much light. Eyes in colors that didn't exist in nature. Eyes that tracked my movement with predatory patience. The elevator dinged. Impossible. It had been broken for 3 weeks, a handwritten, out-of-order sign taped over the buttons. But there it was, doors sliding open to reveal an interior lit by that same cold blue light. The Spanish returned on the digital display. Abajo. Down. I didn't want to enter, but the hallway floor began to splinter beneath my feet, not breaking, but changing, becoming something organic and wet. The elevator suddenly seemed like the lesser evil. I dove in just as the floor completed its transformation into something I didn't want to identify. The doors closed, and the elevator began to descend. The button panel showed floors that didn't exist, negative numbers, symbols I didn't recognize, blank spaces that somehow conveyed depth. We were falling below the basement, below the foundation, below what should be possible. The elevator music was playing backwards. I recognized the tune, some jazz standard, but reversed it became a funeral dirge. The lights flickered in rhythm with it, creating a strobe effect that made movement feel stuttered, disconnected. Then, sudden stop. The doors opened onto my apartment, not a replica, not a similar unit. My actual apartment with my coffee mug still on the counter, still steaming as if I just poured it. But I hadn't made coffee. Hadn't been in the kitchen at all tonight. I stepped out. What choice did I have? And the elevator doors sealed behind me, becoming wall again. The intercom showed a new message. Siempre aquí. Always here. The ceiling footsteps had stopped. The temperature had normalized. Even the laughter had faded to nothing. Just me in my apartment I checked my phone, 3:47 a.m. No time had passed, or all the time had passed and circled back to the same moment. I walked to the window. The rain had stopped, but the city lights below flickered wrong. The patterns didn't match Chicago, didn't match any city I knew. Some buildings were too tall, others seemed to phase in and out of existence. The sky itself was the wrong color. Not black, but a deep purple that suggested something vast swimming just beyond perception. My laptop was open on the desk, showing an email I didn't remember writing. The recipient was my own address. The subject line: documentation of dimensional drift. The body was thousands of lines of text, but not in English, not in Spanish, not in any language that used human characters. Yet somehow, horrifyingly, I could almost understand it. Almost grasp what it was trying to tell me about the nature of space, about the thin points where realities touched, about things that waited in the angles between here and there. The building groaned around me, and I understood then that it wasn't the building at all. It was something wearing the building like a shell, something that had always been here, waiting for someone to notice the laughter in the walls. I'm writing this now on my phone, though I don't know if it will ever send. The signal bars keep shifting to symbols I don't recognize. It's been 3:47 a.m. for what feels like hours. The coffee never stops steaming. The rain outside falls upward sometimes. The intercom just lit up again, this time in English. You were always home. I want to say I'm going crazy. That would be simpler, cleaner. A breakdown has treatment options, medications, doctors who specialize in putting fractured minds back together. But the dust from the ceiling is real. I can feel its grit between my teeth. The cold that comes and goes leaves actual frost on the windows. My coffee mug refills itself when I'm not looking. Something lives in the spaces between the walls. Something that speaks in laughter and walks on ceilings and bends hallways into Mobius strips. It's been here longer than the building, longer than the city, waiting for someone to hear it, to acknowledge it, to become part of its geometry. The sun should be rising soon, but I don't think it will. Not here. Not in this version of the apartment that exists sideways from the real one. Or maybe this is the real one, and everything else was the dream. The laughter is starting again. Closer this time. Not from the hallway or the ceiling, but from inside the room, inside the air itself. It knows I'm listening now, really listening. And once you start hearing the spaces between sounds, you can never unhear them. My reflection in the laptop screen is smiling, but I'm not. I'm not smiling at all. Story 2. The wireless doorbell hasn't had batteries for 3 weeks, but it rings every night at 3 a.m. sharp. I know because I've been watching the clock, waiting, my body rigid against the leather couch in my Denver loft while the city sleeps 30 floors below. It started the day I brought Dad home. The funeral director had handed me the urn with practiced sympathy, his manicured fingers lingering on the bronze surface as if reluctant to let go. The weight surprised me, heavier than I'd expected. Though what exactly had I expected? That grief would make even ashes lighter? I'd placed Dad's urn next to Mom's on the industrial metal shelving unit I'd installed last year, the one that cost too much but looked perfect against the exposed brick. 2 bronze vessels, identical except for the engraved dates, positioned side by side the way they'd slept for 43 years. That first night, the doorbell rang at 3 a.m. I'd stumbled to the intercom, groggy and disoriented, pressing the button with sleep-thick fingers. Static. Just static, but underneath it, something else. A rhythm like breathing, like someone standing too close to a microphone. The LED screen showed nothing but darkness. I checked the actual door, peering through the peephole into the empty hallway with its sensible gray carpet and emergency exit signs. Nothing. The second night brought the phone calls. My cell lit up at 3 a.m., the screen displaying my own number. Impossible, obviously. But there it was, my 10 digits calling me. I answered once. The silence on the other end wasn't empty. It was full, pregnant with something waiting to speak. I could hear the faint buzz of electricity, the almost imperceptible pop of static, and beneath it all, that same breathing rhythm from the doorbell intercom. By the third night, I was ready. I sat in the dark, watching my guitar propped in its stand, waiting. At 3 a.m., the low E string snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then the A string, then the D, one by one, in perfect sequence, as if invisible fingers were tightening the tuning pegs beyond their breaking point. The metal strings whipped through the air, leaving the guitar mutilated, its neck tensed and trembling. I started sleeping, if you could call it sleeping, on the couch after that, as far from the shelf as possible. The loft's open floor plan meant I could see the urns from anywhere except the bathroom, and I found myself watching them constantly, waiting for what? For them to move, to speak, to explain why my ordered life had become a nightly circus of impossibilities. During daylight hours, I researched electromagnetic fields, infrasound, carbon monoxide poisoning. I bought 3 detectors, placed them strategically around the loft. All readings normal. I called an electrician who found nothing wrong with the wiring. The phone company insisted there was no technical way my number could call itself. The doorbell manufacturer confirmed what I already knew. Without batteries, the unit couldn't possibly function. I considered moving the urns to a storage unit, but something stopped me. Guilt, maybe, or fear that distance would make things worse somehow. They sat there on the metal shelf, catching the afternoon light through the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking so ordinary, so benign. Just 2 containers holding what remained of the people who'd made me. The memorial home had included a thick packet of paperwork with Dad's urn, certificates, receipts, care instructions I hadn't bothered to read. Desperate for answers, I spread the papers across my dining table, scanning through legal disclaimers and maintenance guidelines until I found it, buried on page 12 in a section titled Placement and Care. When displaying multiple memorial urns, always ensure there is breathing space between memories. Direct contact between vessels may cause unexpected resonances. Breathing space between memories. The phrase lodged in my mind, repeating like a skipped record. What did that even mean? But at 2:45 a.m., with 15 minutes until the nightly haunting began, I was willing to try anything. I found a piece of tempered glass left over from a bathroom renovation, about 4 inches square and half an inch thick. Perfect. I slid it between the urns, creating a gap, a buffer, a breathing space. The urns now sat separated by clear glass, no longer touching. The silence was immediate and absolute. Not just the absence of supernatural disturbances, the entire loft fell into a quiet so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. The refrigerator's hum vanished. The HVAC system's white noise disappeared. Even the constant urban soundtrack of sirens and traffic from far below ceased to exist. It was the silence of a recording studio, of a sealed tomb, of space itself. 3 a.m. came and went. No doorbell, no phone call, no snapping strings. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and finally slept. For 3 days, the peace held. I returned to my routines. Morning coffee while watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink. Afternoons working from my home office. Evenings reading or practicing on my backup guitar. The urns sat peacefully on their shelf, separated by their glass barrier, as harmless as any other decorative objects. I should have been relieved. I was relieved. But underneath the relief, a new anxiety gnawed at me. The silence felt wrong, too perfect, like the held breath before a scream. I found myself checking the gap between the urns obsessively, measuring it with my eyes, ensuring the glass hadn't shifted. On the 4th day, I bumped the shelf while vacuuming. It was barely a nudge, just my hip grazing the metal frame, but it was enough. The urns slid toward each other, the glass spacer falling forward onto the shelf with a small clink. Bronze touched bronze. The microwave in the kitchen roared to life, its turntable spinning, the digital display flashing 3 boulder over and over. The wall clock above the dining table began moving backward, its second hand ticking counterclockwise, the minute hand creeping in reverse. My laptop on the coffee table opened itself, the screen flickering through websites I'd never visited. texts in languages I couldn't read, images that hurt to look at directly. I scrambled to separate the urns, fumbling with the glass piece, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The moment I restored the gap, everything stopped. The microwave fell silent. The clock resumed normal operation. The laptop screen went dark. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the urns. They looked so innocent, just two bronze vessels catching the late afternoon light. But I knew better now. The space between them wasn't just physical, it was necessary, vital, a boundary that couldn't be crossed. That night I built a better barrier. I found a piece of plexiglass and cut it to size, securing it with museum putty so it couldn't shift or fall. I measured the gap, exactly 7 inches, and marked the shelf with tape to ensure it never changed. I even installed a small webcam focused on the urns, connected to my phone so I could monitor them remotely. The silence returned, but now it felt different. Watchful, like something waiting for me to make a mistake. I started having dreams about the gap. In them, I could see into the space between the urns, and it wasn't empty. It was full of something dark and viscous, something that moved like liquid but wasn't liquid, something that wanted out. In the dreams, my parents stood on either side of the gap, reaching toward each other, their faces twisted with an emotion I couldn't name. Not sadness, not anger. Something older, more fundamental. Hunger, maybe. During waking hours, I researched obsessively. Quantum entanglement, residual consciousness, the electromagnetic signatures of human remains. I found online forums discussing similar experiences, people claiming their loved ones' ashes exhibited strange properties, created unexplainable phenomena. Most of the posts were clearly fiction or delusion, but some had the ring of truth, the specific details that only come from lived experience. One post in particular haunted me. A woman in Portland described keeping her grandparents' ashes in adjacent urns. She reported similar disturbances, electronics malfunctioning, objects moving, sounds with no source. She'd separated the urns like I had and achieved temporary peace. But then she made a mistake. She let them touch for too long, just a few hours while rearranging furniture. After that, separation didn't work anymore. The disturbances continued regardless of distance. The last update on her thread was 2 years old. I thought about that woman often, wondering what happened to her, whether she found a solution or simply learned to live with the chaos. I wondered if I was heading down the same path, if one day my careful maintenance of the gap would fail and the boundary would collapse permanently. The weeks passed in rigid routine. Check the gap, maintain the silence, monitor the camera feed. I worked from home anyway, so it was easy to structure my life around protecting the separation. Friends invited me out less frequently. I'd declined too many times, unable to explain why I couldn't leave the loft for more than a few hours. Dating became impossible. How could I bring someone home, knowing what waited on that shelf? I started talking to the urns. Not crazy talk. At least I didn't think so. Just observations about the day, updates on family members they'd never gotten to meet. One-sided conversations that felt both futile and necessary. Sometimes I swore I could feel them listening. The quality of the silence shifting slightly, becoming more attentive. 3 months after creating the gap, I made my second mistake. I was cleaning, deep cleaning, the kind that involves moving furniture and scrubbing baseboards. I needed to clean behind the shelf. Without thinking, and that's the danger, isn't it? When vigilance becomes routine, I moved both urns to the dining table, together, touching. The reaction was instant but different this time. Instead of chaos, everything in the loft stopped. Not just the electronics, everything. The dust motes frozen in the sunbeams. The second hand on the clock halted mid-tick. My own breath caught in my throat, unable to exhale. The world became a photograph, a frozen moment with me trapped inside. Except for the urns. They vibrated, a low frequency I felt more than heard, making my bones ache and my vision blur. The bronze surfaces began to warm, then heat, becoming too hot to touch, but I had to touch them, had to separate them, had to restore the gap before what? The thought completed itself in a voice that wasn't mine. Before we become one again. I yanked the urns apart, ignoring the burning in my palms, stumbling backward as reality snapped back into motion. The dust swirled. The clock ticked. I gasped, gulping air like a drowning man. My hands were red and blistering, the bronze patterns imprinted on my palms like brands. But worse than the burns was the understanding that came with them. The gap wasn't keeping something in, it was keeping something apart. Something that had been separated by death but refused to accept that separation. The breathing space between memories wasn't about the urns. It was about what remained inside them, still aware, still reaching for each other across an impossible divide. I bandaged my hands and rebuilt the barrier, this time using a thick piece of acrylic bolted to the shelf itself. Immovable, permanent. The gap restored, the silence returned, but now I understood its true nature. It wasn't peace, it was held breath. It was the pause between heartbeats. It was the space between one thought and the next, where something else might slip through. The burns healed, but the patterns remained, faint scars in the shape of bronze filigree. Sometimes they itch, sometimes late at night they burn again. And I know without checking that somehow, somewhere in the quantum uncertainty of existence, the urns are touching across dimensions I can't perceive. I've stopped trying to understand it rationally. There is no rational explanation for the way my phone sometimes displays text messages I never received, words of love in my parents' handwriting. There's no science that explains why the bathroom mirror sometimes shows 3 reflections instead of 1. There's no logic to the way I sometimes wake up at 3:04 a.m. to find myself standing at the shelf, my scarred hands reaching for the barrier, muscle memory of an action I don't remember taking. The instruction manual was right. There must always be breathing space between memories, because memories, it turns out, don't die with the body. They persist, they reach, they hunger for reconnection. And the only thing standing between their desire and its fulfillment is a gap of 7 inches and my increasingly fragile determination to maintain it. I've made arrangements. When I die, my instructions are clear. Cremation, yes, but my ashes are to be scattered, not stored. Spread across the mountains, dissolved in the ocean, dispersed so thoroughly that no container could ever hold them. I will not become another urn on someone's shelf, reaching across an impossible gap for a connection that death was supposed to sever. But sometimes, in the silence of 3:00 a.m., I wonder if it's already too late. If the patterns burned into my palms are more than scars. If every time I've touched the urns, I've taken something of them into myself, or left something of myself behind. If one day someone will need to maintain a breathing space around me too. The wireless doorbell hasn't rung in months. But last night at 3 a.m., I heard something new. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, measured, walking back and forth. I didn't check. I didn't look through the peephole. I sat on my couch, watching the shelf, maintaining my vigil over the gap, because I recognized the rhythm of those steps. It was the same pattern my father used to pace when he couldn't sleep, the same weight distribution my mother adopted after her hip surgery. They're looking for a way in, not into the loft, they're already here, in their urns, in the space between, in the scars on my hands. They're looking for a way into this moment, this reality, this world where they can finally close the gap between them. And I'm the only thing stopping them. Me and 7 inches of empty space, the breathing room between memories, the boundary between what was and what still tries to be. Every night at 3:00 a.m. I sit watch. Every day I check the gap. And sometimes when the silence becomes too perfect, too complete, I swear I can hear them breathing. Story 3. The fluorescent lights in the Albuquerque hotel corridor hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I'd been awake for 37 hours, driving straight from the lab in Colorado after the accident, after she'd vanished into that twisted metal sculpture that used to be her Corolla. The state trooper had shown me photographs of the wreckage, airbags deployed, driver's seat empty, no blood. just absence where a person should have been. My colleague had disappeared between mile markers 247 and 248 on I-25, somewhere in that stretch of highway where cell towers become suggestions and the desert swallows sound. We'd worked together for 3 years in the atmospheric research lab, measuring invisible things, tracking particles that shouldn't exist. She'd been brilliant at detecting anomalies in air composition, could sense changes in pressure that our instruments missed. The night before the accident, she'd left me a voicemail about readings that didn't make sense, CO2 spikes in sealed chambers, molecular behaviors that violated basic physics. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have answered that call. The hotel room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and something else, something organic and wrong, like fruit left too long in a sealed container. I'd chosen this place specifically because it was nowhere, a waypoint between significance, the kind of establishment where desk clerks don't remember faces and security cameras record over themselves every 12 hours. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to understand why the lab director had insisted I take immediate leave, why my keycard had been deactivated before I'd even left the parking garage. Sleep came reluctantly, pulling me under in waves. The dream started the way trauma dreams do, mundane, almost boring. I was back in the lab, running routine calibrations, when I felt fingers on my chin. Her fingers, though I couldn't see her face. The grip was firm, insistent, pulling my head down toward something warm and soft. Her abdomen pressed against my face, and through the fabric of what felt like a lab coat, I could hear something moving inside her, something wet and deliberate. "Listen with your face," she whispered, though the voice seemed to come from everywhere except her mouth. The sound vibrated through her stomach, through my skull, settling into my bones like an infection. I woke to that same whisper continuing in the darkness of my hotel room. Not an echo or a memory, but the actual sound, as if the dream had torn a hole between sleeping and waking. The whisper came from the walls, from the air vents, from the spaces between molecules. My body was rigid, paralyzed in that primitive way that happens when the amygdala recognizes a threat the conscious mind can't name. The door handle turned. Slow, deliberate, testing. The electronic lock hadn't engaged. I could see the red light blinking in the darkness. But I'd checked it 3 times before bed, heard the mechanism click. The handle returned to its neutral position, then turned again, further this time. The door remained closed, but barely, held by nothing more than atmospheric pressure and my racing heartbeat. I forced myself to move, to reach for my phone, but the screen was dead, not powered off. Dead in a way that suggested it had never worked at all. The bathroom light wouldn't turn on. The bedside lamp clicked uselessly. But in the corridor outside, I could see light seeping under my door, pulsing in a rhythm that matched the whisper still threading through the air. Standing required more courage than I'd ever needed in my life. My bare feet found the carpet, and I noticed how it felt damp, though nothing had spilled. Each step toward the door stretched time, made the 10 feet feel like a marathon. The handle was cold when I touched it, colder than metal should be in a climate-controlled building. I pulled the door open. The corridor lights were having a seizure. Not all of them, just a specific trail leading left toward the elevator bank. They dimmed and brightened in sequence, creating a path of illumination that my feet followed before my brain could object. The whisper was louder here, coming from the walls themselves, from the geometric pattern in the carpet that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The elevator doors were open, though I hadn't heard them move. Inside, the mirror showed my reflection and something else, a distortion at waist height, a shimmer in the air like heat waves rising from pavement. It moved when I moved, stayed exactly 3 feet ahead of me, maintaining a presence I could feel but couldn't fully see. The whisper was coming from it now, from that space where physics bent wrong. I backed out of the elevator, turned toward the stairwell, but the door there was wrong too. The push bar was at hip height instead of waist height, as if designed for someone much shorter, or someone whose mouth was located in their midsection. The thought came unbidden, ridiculous, but once it arrived, I couldn't dismiss it. Everything in the corridor had shifted subtly, light switches lower on the walls, door handles angled differently, even the fire extinguisher mounted at a height that would be convenient for someone whose head was where their stomach should be. My room was 17 doors back, but I couldn't make myself return to it. The whisper had become conversational now, no longer just sound, but almost words, syllables that hovered at the edge of meaning. I could feel them trying to organize themselves in my brain, to become language, but some part of me resisted, knowing that understanding would be worse than ignorance. The security office was on the ground floor. I took the stairs, each landing revealing more alterations to the building's geometry. Handrails that curved inward at stomach height, emergency exit signs positioned to be read from below, water fountains with their spouts reversed, pointing up at angles that made no sense unless you imagined someone bending backward to drink. The security guard was absent, but his monitors still glowed. I rewound the footage from my floor, found the timestamp from 5 minutes ago. There I was in the corridor, clear as surveillance video could make me. But I wasn't alone. My shadow had a companion, shorter, maybe 4 feet tall, walking beside me with a gait that suggested their weight was distributed differently than a normal person's. The shadow's middle seemed denser, more substantial, while its extremities were barely visible. In the video, I appeared to be listening intently, nodding occasionally, my head tilted down at an angle that would be appropriate for listening to a child. Except the shadow beside me wasn't child-shaped. It was wrong-shaped, anatomy reorganized. A person folded into themselves until their center became their entirety. The whisper in the security office grew urgent. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums from the inside, trying to make me understand something crucial. My hand moved without my permission, reaching for the desk drawer. Inside was the guard's sign-in log, and there, in handwriting I recognized, was an entry from 3 hours ago. My colleague's name, her lab ID number, and in the destination column, visiting room 237, continuing research. Room 237 was my room. I ran back to the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, the whisper now a roar that seemed to come from my own chest cavity. The CO2 detector I'd packed, standard equipment for field research, was screaming in my luggage when I burst through my door. The device was off, battery removed, but its alarm pierced the air anyway, measuring something that wasn't carbon dioxide but occupied the same space, breathed the same way, existed in the gaps between molecules. The bathroom mirror showed me something I didn't want to see. My reflection was wrong, distorted at the midsection. My shirt stretched as if something inside was trying to push out. The whisper was coming from me now, from that space below my ribs where she'd pressed my face in the dream. I could feel words forming in my stomach, sentences digesting themselves before they could be born, meaning dissolving in acid and reforming as something else. I called the lab from the hotel phone, the landline crackling with interference that sounded like breathing. The director answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. She was working on something, I said, though the words felt thick, wrong-shaped in my mouth. Before the accident, she found something in the readings. His silence stretched too long before he replied, told me to stay where I was, that someone would come, but I could hear it in his voice. The same whisper, the same wrong frequency that had been following me since the dream. It was in him too, in all of them probably, everyone who'd been exposed to those impossible readings, those CO2 spikes that weren't CO2 at all, but something else trying to exist in our dimension, using our bodies as doorways. The mirror cracked while I watched, a spider web spreading from exactly where my stomach reflected. Through the breaks I could see movement, not behind the glass but within it, in that impossible space between reflection and reality. The whisper had become a voice now, her voice, explaining everything in words that my brain couldn't quite process, but my body understood completely. We'd been measuring the wrong things in the lab. Not atmospheric composition, but atmospheric consciousness. Not particles, but possibilities. She'd found the frequency where human awareness overlapped with something else. Something that had always been here, existing in the spaces we couldn't perceive. The accident hadn't taken her. It had transformed her, redistributed her consciousness to a place where listening happened differently, where communication required new organs, new ways of being. The CO2 detector finally died, its last shriek fading into a whisper that matched the one still flowing through my bones. I understood now why she'd wanted me to listen with my face, why the building had reconfigured itself for bodies that thought with their centers instead of their heads. Evolution hadn't stopped. We'd just been measuring it wrong, looking up when we should have been looking in. I left the hotel as dawn broke over the desert, the whisper now a constant companion that lived somewhere between my diaphragm and my consciousness. The lab had called 17 times, but I didn't answer. I knew what they wanted, to study what I'd become, to measure the transformation, to understand how she'd learned to exist in the spaces between breathing. But some knowledge can't be contained in data sets. Some evolution happens in dreams first, in the moments between heartbeats, in the whispers that come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I drove toward the sunrise, the road stretching infinite, my shadow in the rearview mirror showing two shapes now, one sitting normally, the other folded into itself, teaching me to listen with parts of myself I didn't know could hear. The radio played only static, but in that white noise I could hear her explaining everything, patient and terrible, about the world that existed in parallel to ours, separated only by the thickness of perception. We'd been looking for anomalies in the atmosphere, but the atmosphere had been looking back, waiting for someone to discover the frequency where consciousness could redistribute itself, where human geometry could be rewritten, where whispers could become flesh, and flesh could become whispers. I'm still driving. The whisper never stops. Sometimes I catch myself responding, my words coming from deeper in my body each time, my thoughts originating from places that aren't my brain. The transformation is slow but inevitable, a gradual redistribution of self that starts with dreams and ends with something I can't quite imagine yet. But I'm beginning to understand what she meant. To truly listen, you need more than ears. You need to reshape yourself around the sound, to let it colonize the spaces between your cells, to accept that communication sometimes requires becoming something that can no longer use words the way humans do. The CO2 detector in my bag has started beeping again, measuring my transformation in particles per million, tracking my evolution in frequencies that shouldn't exist. I think I'm almost ready to listen with my face. Story 4. The first night back, I should have known something was wrong when I woke to David Attenborough's voice narrating the mating rituals of carpenter ants. The television glowed in the corner of the living room, casting blue shadows across walls I hadn't seen illuminated past 9 p.m. in over 15 years. Dad always fell asleep to documentaries, nature shows, military biographies, anything that droned on past midnight with authoritative British accents and sweeping orchestral scores. But Dad was gone now, had been for 3 months, and I'd unplugged every electronic device before collapsing on the couch that first night back in Minnesota. I sat up, my neck stiff from sleeping at an odd angle, and stared at the screen. A close-up of mandibles tearing through wood fiber filled the frame, while Attenborough's voice explained the architectural genius of insect societies. The remote sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, next to a glass of water that had grown a film of dust, and the house keys I'd inherited along with mortgage payments and memories I wasn't ready to face. The floorboards creaked as I walked to the television, each step echoing in the silence between documentary narration. When I pressed the power button, the screen went black, but the sound continued for several seconds. A phantom voice explaining how colonies communicate through chemical signals, how they follow invisible trails left by their predecessors. Then silence. I checked every plug in the house twice before returning to the couch. The digital clock on the cable box remained dark. The outlets were empty, yet something in the air felt charged, expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. I'd fall asleep reading or sorting through Dad's belongings, and sometime before dawn, that blue glow would wake me. Always documentaries. Always the same calm, educational voices discussing migration patterns of Arctic terns or the tactical brilliance of Civil War generals. Each morning, I'd find the television on, volume adjusted to exactly the level Dad preferred, loud enough to hear from the kitchen, soft enough not to disturb neighbors who lived too far away to matter. The third week, I started keeping a notebook. Dates, times, programs, looking for patterns, trying to apply logic to a situation that felt increasingly untethered from reason. October 15th, Wolves of Yellowstone, 3:17 a.m. October 16th, Rommel, the Desert Fox, 2:43 a.m. October 18th, The Secret Life of Fungus, 4:02 a.m. All programs Dad had owned on DVD, all titles I'd seen scattered across his nightstand or stacked beside his recliner. But the cable package had been canceled months ago, and these weren't reruns I could find on any remaining channels. The notebook became a compulsion. I started staying awake, determined to catch the moment of activation. But vigilance proved impossible to maintain, and exhaustion would eventually claim me. I'd drift off in the recliner or stretched across the living room floor, and inevitably wake to that familiar blue glow and the sound of knowledge being distributed to an audience of empty rooms and accumulated dust. It was during one of these involuntary vigils that I first noticed the draft. The sensation started as barely perceptible coolness against my ankles, a whisper of air movement in a house that had been sealed tight against October's early frost. At first, I attributed it to old construction, to gaps in weather stripping that needed attention. But as days passed, the draft became more pronounced, more directional. It always began at the basement door. The basement had been Dad's workshop, a collection of half-finished projects and tools arranged with the obsessive precision of a man who found comfort in order. I'd been avoiding it, telling myself I wasn't ready to face that particular archaeology of abandonment. But the draft seemed to originate from somewhere below, flowing up through the house like a cold river following some ancient invisible current. I started leaving interior doors open to track its movement. The air would rise from the basement, drift through the kitchen, and pool in the living room before dispersing toward the front of the house. Sometimes I could see it disturbing the dust motes that danced in afternoon sunlight, creating small whirlwinds of debris that spun and settled in patterns I couldn't decipher. The kitchen door presented the most disturbing phenomenon. It was an old wooden door, painted white, with a chain-link security latch that Dad had installed during a brief paranoid phase in the 80s. The chain would sway with the passing air current, creating a rhythmic metallic whisper that sounded almost like breathing. But the movement was too regular, too purposeful. It swayed as if something, was gently pushing it open just enough to peer through, then letting it fall closed again. I found myself timing the oscillations. 3 seconds open, 2 seconds closed. Repeat. Always the same pattern, always synchronized with that mysterious draft flowing through the house like circulation in a body I couldn't see. During the 4th week, I called my uncle in Duluth, trying to inject some normalcy into conversations that felt increasingly surreal. He asked about the house, about whether I planned to sell, about practical matters that seemed to exist in a different reality from the one I was experiencing. "The old place treating you okay?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of shared history and unspoken concern. I almost told him about the television, about the draft, about the way the house seemed to be performing its own nightly rituals. Instead, I heard myself saying everything was fine, that I was managing well, that the solitude was helping me process grief in healthy ways. But after hanging up, I stood in the kitchen watching that chain sway back and forth, and I realized I was lying not just to him, but to myself. Nothing about this was fine. Nothing about this was healthy. The house wasn't just sheltering me. It was doing something else, something I didn't have words for yet. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening directly. "Enough," I said aloud, my voice echoing off walls that suddenly seemed closer than they had moments before. Just enough. I was standing in the living room, having spent another day sorting through boxes of Dad's belongings, each item a small archaeological dig into a life I'd observed from the periphery. His reading glasses, prescription bottles with dates from before his final hospital stay, notebooks filled with measurements and sketches for projects that would never be completed. The word hung in the air, enough. And for the first time in weeks, the house felt completely silent. No humming of hidden electronics, no whisper of air movement, No metallic breathing from the kitchen door. Even the ambient sounds of an old building settling into evening quiet seemed muted, as if my declaration had created a vacuum of expectation. That's when I noticed the paper cup. It sat on the small side table beside Dad's recliner. A simple white cup from the hospital, the kind with a plastic lid and bendable straw that I'd helped him drink from during those final weeks. I'd been meaning to throw it away, but somehow it had survived multiple cleaning sessions, migrating from room to room like a physical manifestation of procrastination and guilt. Now it was vibrating. The movement was subtle at first, barely perceptible tremors that could have been explained by settling floors or distant traffic. But as I watched, the vibrations intensified, causing the cup to shift position on the table with tiny, incremental movements. Then it began to turn. The rotation was slow, deliberate, as if guided by some invisible hand adjusting its orientation with careful precision. It spun clockwise, pausing occasionally before continuing its methodical revolution. When it finally stopped, the cup's rim was pointing directly toward the back of the house, toward the sliding glass door that led to the porch, toward the overgrown garden and the line of pine trees that marked the property boundary. I approached the table cautiously, half convinced that proximity would reveal some rational explanation. A vibrating phone hidden beneath papers, perhaps, or some mechanical system cycling through its operations. But the cup sat motionless now, perfectly oriented like a compass needle locked onto magnetic north. Except it wasn't pointing north. It was pointing toward the porch. The sliding door stood partially open. Had I left it that way? The screen door beyond was intact, but something about the gap disturbed me in ways I couldn't articulate. Cool evening air moved through the opening, carrying scents of decomposing leaves and something else, something organic and unfamiliar that made my throat tighten with instinctive unease. I reached for the cup, intending to move it, to break whatever spell or delusion was taking hold of my increasingly fragile grip on rational explanation. But the moment my fingers made contact with the paper surface, that draft returned with renewed intensity. Cold air swept through the house like a tide, strong enough to rustle papers and disturb the careful arrangements I'd made of Dad's belongings. The television clicked on, not the gentle activation I'd grown accustomed to, but a sharp electronic snap that echoed through rooms suddenly alive with movement and purpose. But instead of documentaries, the screen displayed static, white noise that filled the room with the sound of rainfall or distant applause or whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. And through that static, shapes moved. Not clearly, not definitively, but with enough suggestion to make my vision strain and my imagination supply details that logic insisted weren't there. I turned toward the porch, toward whatever the cup had been indicating with its impossible precision, and saw that the screen door was no longer intact. A section near the bottom had been pushed outward, creating a gap just large enough for something to pass through. Something low to the ground, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. The draft intensified, and with it came a new sound. Not quite breathing, not quite speech, but a rhythmic exhalation that seemed to emanate from multiple sources simultaneously. From the basement, from the kitchen, from the porch, from spaces between walls where sound shouldn't travel but somehow did. I backed away from the door, from the cup, from everything that had seemed familiar just moments before. The house around me felt larger now, as if rooms had expanded beyond their original dimensions, creating spaces where shadows could gather and purposes could form without interference from the physical laws I'd always trusted. The television static grew louder, more insistent, and within that white noise I began to distinguish individual frequencies, voices that rose and fell like conversation, like instruction, like coordination between elements of some vast network that had been quietly organizing itself around my presence. That's when I understood that I'd been wrong about everything. The house wasn't haunted by Dad's ghost, wasn't responding to the psychic residue of his final years spent alone in these rooms. The house was responding to something else, something that had been waiting with infinite patience for the right conditions to manifest. Something that had been using Dad's routines, his preferences, his technological habits as a foundation for its own emergence into observable reality. The documentaries, the draft patterns, The mechanical precision of the door chain's movement, all of it had been practice, preparation for a more direct form of communication. And now, with my declaration of enough, I'd somehow given it permission to stop pretending to be the ghost of a man who loved educational television and always left interior doors open for a cat he'd never owned. The gap in the screen door widened as I watched, metal frame bending outward with slow, deliberate pressure, not breaking, adapting, creating an opening that accommodated whatever was ready to stop hiding in the spaces between explanation and experience. I looked down at the paper cup, still pointing toward the porch with unwavering accuracy. In the television static, voices continued their urgent, coordinated discussion, and I realized they were talking about me, about the house, about opportunities that arose when isolation and grief created conditions suitable for contact. The draft became a wind, strong enough to scatter Dad's carefully organized papers across rooms that suddenly felt too large and too small simultaneously. The sound of coordination grew more distinct, more purposeful, and I understood that whatever had been patient enough to spend months learning the rhythms of human habitation was ready to reveal the true scope of its presence. I reached for the sliding door handle, intending to seal the house against whatever was preparing to emerge from the darkness beyond the porch. But my hand stopped halfway to the metal surface, held in place not by physical restraint, but by the sudden certainty that closing the door wouldn't solve anything. Because the problem, if that's what this was, had never been outside the house. It had been inside all along, watching from corners where electronic devices cast shadows, listening from spaces where air moved in patterns that defied architectural logic, learning from the traces left by a man who'd spent his final years talking to empty rooms and leaving doors open for companionship that existed just outside the range of normal perception. The cup trembled once more, its orientation shifting slightly, and I followed its new direction with eyes that felt too wide, too receptive to information I wasn't prepared to process. It was pointing at me now, and in that moment of realization, as the television static resolved into something that might have been language, and the draft became a presence with weight and intention, I understood that the real question wasn't whether any of this was actually happening. The real question was whether I'd ever been alone in the house at all, or whether something had been sharing these rooms with me from the very first night, patiently teaching me to recognize the signs of a communication system I'd been unconsciously participating in for months. The paper cup held its new orientation with perfect steadiness, and in the silence that followed my recognition of its meaning, I heard something that might have been laughter, or might have been the sound of old pipes settling, or might have been the whispered coordinates of a map to territories where the distinction between observer and observed becomes a matter of perspective rather than fact. Outside, the wind moved through pine branches with a sound like applause, and I stood in the living room of my childhood home, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a haunting that had never been about the dead at all. It had always been about the living, and what they're willing to accept when loneliness becomes a conversation partner, and isolation transforms into a form of invitation that entities with patience and intelligence know how to answer. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in the print shop never quite stopped buzzing, not even after I'd been there 3 weeks. They hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache, especially during the graveyard shift when the building settled into its nocturnal rhythms. I'd taken the job at Quick Print Reno out of desperation. Bills don't pay themselves, and night differential meant an extra $4 an hour. What I hadn't counted on was how the emptiness of the place at 2 a.m. would amplify every sound, every shadow, every doubt that crept through my mind. It started with the messages. The internal messaging system was ancient, some DOS-based program from the early 90s that management refused to update. Green text on black screens, the kind that burned after images into your retinas if you stared too long. My first week, I barely noticed them. Routine maintenance reminders, shift change notes, the usual corporate detritus. But then the messages signed M. Travis began appearing. Check the cyan levels on press 3. Alignment feels off tonight. Simple enough. Helpful even. I'd assumed M. Travis worked the evening shift, leaving notes for whoever came after. The thing was, when I checked with the evening crew, nobody knew who M. Travis was. HR had no record of anyone by that name. Not current employees, not former ones going back 5 years. The messages kept coming, always during my shift, always between 2 and 4 a.m. when the building felt most hollow. They grew more specific, more personal. The temperature differential in Bay 2 causes registration issues. Watch for it. Don't trust the pressure readings on the folder. They lie. You remind me of someone who used to work these machines. That last one made my skin crawl. I'd typed back once, asking who M. Travis was, where they were messaging from. The response came instantly. 3rd floor mezzanine, always watching the game. There was no 3rd floor mezzanine. The building only had 2 floors. The word break started appearing in the messages 2 weeks later. Not as a verb, but as a noun, always capitalized. Time for a break. Or, the machine needs a break. Every time, every single time, that word appeared, the industrial printer would seize up, not just any part of it, but specifically at the paper feed mechanism, what the old-timers called the throat or neck of the machine. The rollers would compress with such force that they'd leave deep grooves in the metal guides, as if invisible hands were strangling the life out of the equipment. I started documenting everything: screenshots of the messages, photographs of the damage, audio recordings of the sounds that shouldn't exist. Because there were sounds, God, there were sounds. The PA system, which should have been dormant during night shift, would crackle to life with bursts of static that almost sounded like voices, like someone calling for a pass, asking to get in the game. The frequency spikes showed up on my phone's audio spectrum analyzer, sharp peaks at 1 kHz and 3 kHz, the exact frequencies of human speech. I found the basketball first, tucked behind a stack of old paper boxes in what the building blueprint labeled as Storage Area B, but what everyone called the mezzanine. It was a Warren Wilson, the kind they used in the 80s, with someone's initials barely visible in faded Sharpie, MT. The ball was still inflated, still bounced with that satisfying thwack against the concrete floor. When I dribbled it experimentally, the echo filled the entire print shop, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I heard sneakers squeaking on a court that didn't exist. The badge came next, wedged under a filing cabinet in the break room. The magnetic strip was dead, demagnetized by age or something else, but the photo was clear enough. A young man, maybe 25, with the kind of eager smile people have on their first day at a new job. The name read Mitchell Travis, and the date. The date was from 1987. I researched obsessively during my breaks, hunched over my phone in the parking lot where the Wi-Fi signal was strongest. Mitchell Travis had worked at QuickPrint Reno for 3 years. Model employee, according to the archived newsletters I found on the Wayback Machine. He'd organized the company basketball team, the Print Devils, and they'd even won a few local tournaments. The newsletters stopped mentioning him in 1990. No farewell announcement, no mention of why he'd left. He just wasn't there anymore. The receipts were harder to explain. They started appearing in the output trays of printers I wasn't even operating. Purchase orders, delivery confirmations, work orders, all dated from the late 80s and early 90s, all bearing Mitchell Travis's employee ID. The paper was fresh, newly printed, but the information was decades old. One receipt showed a rush order for 5,000 flyers. Missing person. Have you seen this man? The photo was too pixelated to make out clearly, but the dimensions, the shadows, they looked familiar. I started avoiding mirrors after that. The compression incidents, that's what I called them in my head, grew worse. The printer's throat would seize so violently that the entire frame would shake, bolts loosening, metal groaning. I'd have to power cycle the entire system, and during those moments when the machine wound down, I could hear it in the dying whir of the motors, a rhythmic pattern like labored breathing, like someone trying to speak through a crushed windpipe. 3 nights ago, I'd had enough. I confronted the empty air of the print shop, feeling ridiculous but desperate. "Mitchell," I said to the humming fluorescents and silent machines, "what do you want?" The message appeared instantly on every terminal in the building. The same two words repeated in endless scrolling lines. Foul play, foul play, foul play, foul play, I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I clocked out 4 hours early, made up some excuse about food poisoning. But I came back the next night because rent was due, and because something in those messages felt less like a threat and more like a plea. Last night, I found the final piece. Hidden in the maintenance log from October 1990, a single entry, press 3 fatal malfunction. Employee M. Travis caught in paper feed mechanism during late-night maintenance. Compression injury to trachea. Machine decommissioned and replaced. Press 3. The same printer that seized up every time the word break appeared in the messages. The same printer I'd been operating for 3 weeks. I looked up the serial number. Press 3 hadn't been replaced in 1990. It had been refurbished. The same bones, the same metal frame, just with new components grafted on like organ transplants. The printer I'd been feeding paper into every night was the same one that had compressed. The messages changed after I found the log. They became more urgent, more coherent. Not an accident. Evening shift supervisor K. Brennan. Jealousy over promotion. Disabled safety mechanisms. No one believed. No one looked. You look like him. You look exactly like him. That's when I understood why my reflection had been bothering me. Why I'd been avoiding mirrors. The photo on Mitchell's badge, once I really looked at it, once I stopped dismissing the similarity as coincidence, the resemblance was uncanny. Same jaw, same eyes, same nervous habit of rubbing the back of my neck when thinking. I called my mother this morning, asked about family history, genealogy, relatives in Nevada. She laughed, said I was getting paranoid working those night shifts. But then she mentioned it, almost as an afterthought. Her brother Mitchell, who'd moved to Reno in the 80s to work at some print company. He'd stopped calling one day. The family assumed he'd just drifted away, the way some people do. I'm writing this on my phone, sitting in my car in the quick print parking lot. My shift starts in 10 minutes. The building looms against the desert sky. Its windows dark except for the one on the second floor. The one that doesn't exist on the building plans. The one that flickers sometimes with the phantom light of a basketball court that was never there. The messages have stopped coming from M. Travis. The last one arrived an hour ago from my own employee ID. Time for the night shift. Time to remember. I check my reflection in the rearview mirror, and for a second, just a second, I see him looking back. Mitchell Travis, young and eager, ready for his first day at a new job. Ready to work the night shift. Ready to stay. My phone buzzes. A message from the internal system which shouldn't even be accessible from out here. The game's starting. Your serve. I should drive away. I should quit. Find another job. Leave Reno altogether. But my hand is already on the door handle. My feet already know the path to the employee entrance. The night shift is calling, and somewhere in the buzz of fluorescent lights and the whisper of industrial printers, Mitchell Travis is waiting. Waiting for someone who looks exactly like him. Waiting for family. Waiting for me to understand that some shifts never really end. They just wait for the right person to clock in again. The building's door closes behind me with a soft click. Somewhere above, I hear the distant, impossible sound of a basketball bouncing on a court that doesn't exist. I check the schedule on my phone. My name isn't on it anymore. Mitchell Travis is. Story 6. And the first time I saw him, I thought he was just another curious local drawn to the construction noise. 3 weeks into the Rochester Bypass project, and I'd grown accustomed to the occasional onlooker peering through gaps in the chain-link fencing. But this one was different. He stood perfectly still behind the orange mesh barriers, his shoulders squared toward my transit, watching me work with an intensity that made the hair on my forearms prickle. He wore a faded red flannel shirt and a navy work cap pulled low over his eyes, and where his left sleeve should have been filled by an arm, the fabric hung empty and loose, pinned against his torso. Even from 50 yards away, I could sense his focus on my plumb line, the way his head tilted slightly as I adjusted the instrument's leveling screws. The morning air carried an unusual metallic tang, sharp and copper bright. like the taste that floods your mouth before you vomit. I figured it was runoff from the demolition work upstream, but when I checked my watch to log the reading, the second hand seemed to be dragging, each tick stretching longer than it should have. By the time I looked back toward the fence, the man was gone. I told myself it was nothing. 22 years of survey work teaches you that construction sites attract all kinds: the lonely, the curious, the bored. But over the next 3 days, as I mapped the elevation changes along the proposed roadway, I found myself glancing toward that section of fence more often than I cared to admit. The metallic smell came and went like a tide, strongest when the wind shifted from the northeast, and my watch continued its sluggish behavior whenever I worked that particular grid square. Thursday morning brought me to the second site, a bridge foundation survey 15 miles south near Dansville. The terrain was different here, rolling hills giving way to a creek bed that would need careful grading, but the work was familiar. I'd just finished setting up when I spotted him again. Same flannel shirt, same navy cap, same empty sleeve. He stood behind a temporary construction fence about 60 feet from my position, motionless as a scarecrow. The sight hit me like cold water in the chest. I blinked hard, certain I was mistaken, but when I looked again, he was still there, his hidden face angled toward my equipment with that same unwavering attention. This time, I didn't hesitate. I left my instruments and walked directly toward the fence, my boots crunching through the gravel and clay mixture that covered the access road. But with each step I took in his direction, the metallic smell grew stronger, until it felt like I was breathing through wet copper pennies. My watch face seemed to blur. The hands moving so slowly, I wondered if the battery was dying. By the time I reached the fence, he was gone again. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest anyone had been standing there at all. I spent 10 minutes walking the perimeter, looking for some sign of him, but found only the lingering metallic taste in the air and the peculiar sluggishness of time that seemed to follow his appearances. That evening, at the Comfort Inn on Route 20, I stood under the shower trying to wash away the day's accumulated dust and the nagging feeling that I was being watched. The water ran cold at first, then scalding, and when I stepped out and reached for my towel, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Dark red clay, still damp, circled the drain in a perfect spiral. Not the light brown soil I'd been working in all day, but deep red clay, the color of dried blood. I knelt and touched it with my finger. It was soft, almost warm, and carried that same metallic smell I'd been encountering at the job sites. I'd never seen clay like this in the Rochester area. The local soil was predominantly sandy loam with limestone deposits, nothing remotely resembling this rich red earth. I spent the next hour cleaning the shower, scrubbing until my knuckles were raw, and the last traces of the clay had disappeared down the drain. But sleep came fitfully that night, broken by dreams of empty sleeves and the sound of someone walking through wet clay just outside my door. The third site was a subdivision layout near Geneseo, 40 miles east of the previous location. I arrived early, hoping to finish the preliminary survey work before the afternoon heat made the job miserable. The development property sprawled across a former farmland, gently rolling acres that would soon be carved into lots for cookie-cutter houses. I was checking my notes against the property markers when I saw him for the third time. He stood at the far edge of the property, near a line of mature oak trees, his familiar silhouette unmistakable even at a distance of nearly 100 yards. The same clothes, the same posture, the same empty sleeve hanging at his side. My hands began to shake as I raised my binoculars for a closer look. Through the lenses, I could see his face more clearly than before. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, or what I could see of them beneath the bill of his cap, seemed to reflect light like an animal's would at night. But it was his expression that made me lower the binoculars with shaking hands. He was smiling. The metallic smell rolled across the field like fog, so strong now that I gagged and spat into the grass. My watch had stopped completely, its hands frozen at 9:47, and the world around me seemed to have taken on a dreamlike quality, sounds muffled and colors too bright. I forced myself to pack up my equipment, fighting the urge to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get back to my truck and drive until I couldn't drive anymore. But I needed this job, needed the steady income it provided. I told myself I was overreacting, that stress and long hours were making me paranoid. People see what they want to see, and maybe I was just projecting my own anxieties onto random strangers. But as I loaded my gear into the truck bed, I caught sight of him in my peripheral vision, closer now, standing just inside the tree line. When I turned to look directly at him, he raised his good arm in what might have been a wave or a warning. Then he stepped backward into the shadows between the oaks and vanished. The drive back to the motel took longer than it should have. Traffic was light on the rural highways, but I found myself taking unnecessary detours, avoiding the most direct routes, as if some part of my subconscious was trying to delay my return. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, the sun was already setting, painting the sky the color of rust and old blood. My room was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot and a small wooded area beyond. I climbed the external stairs slowly, my legs feeling heavier with each step, and fumbled with the key card until the lock clicked green. The room was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Bed made, curtains drawn, air conditioning humming. But something felt wrong. The air was too thick, too warm, and that metallic smell lingered faintly, as if it had followed me inside. I went through my evening routine mechanically. Shower, dinner from the vending machine, review of the next day's work schedule. But concentration eluded me. Every few minutes I found myself checking the window, peering through the gap in the curtains to scan the parking lot below. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, more persistent, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Around 10 o'clock I gave up trying to focus on work and decided to get some air. Maybe a walk around the block would clear my head, help me shake off the paranoia that had been building all day. I grabbed my key card and headed for the door, but something made me pause with my hand on the handle. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming, and my watch, which I'd reset after the morning's incident, had stopped again. The hands pointed to the same time as before, 9:47. I turned the knob slowly, dreading what I might find on the other side. The hallway was empty, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that cast everything in sickly white light. But as I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Muddy footprints led from the stairwell to my door, then continued down the hallway toward the other rooms. They were deep impressions, left by work boots, and the mud was that same distinctive red clay I'd found in my shower the night before. I followed the trail, my bare feet silent on the industrial carpeting. The prints were still damp, as if whoever had made them had just passed this way. They led to the stairwell at the far end of the hall, then disappeared at the threshold. I peered down the stairs but saw nothing in the darkness below. When I returned to my room, I noticed something else that hadn't been there before. The trunk of my rental car, visible through the window, was slightly ajar. The gap was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but I was certain I'd closed it securely that morning. I'd been fastidious about locking up my equipment since starting this job, paranoid about theft in unfamiliar territory. I should have called the front desk, reported the potential break-in, demanded a different room or a refund. Instead, I found myself walking back down the stairs across the parking lot toward my car. The asphalt was warm beneath my feet, still radiating the day's heat, and the air was thick with humidity and the smell of cooling engines. The trunk lid lifted easily under my touch, revealing the neat arrangement of survey equipment I'd loaded earlier. Transit case, tripod, measuring rods, all exactly where they belonged. But resting on top of my equipment bag was something that definitely hadn't been there before. A work cap, navy blue with a sweat-stained band, covered in the same red clay that had appeared in my shower. I lifted it with trembling fingers. The fabric was damp and still carried the metallic smell that had been haunting me for days. Inside the crown, faded letters spelled out a name. J. Morrison, ironworker, Local 6. The cap looked old, worn thin by years of use, and the clay that caked its surface was still soft, as if it had been dug from the earth only hours before. A sound behind me made me spin around. The cap clutched in my hands. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, where the asphalt met the wooded area. Even in the dim light cast by the motel's security lamps, I recognized the familiar silhouette. The flannel shirt, the navy cap, the empty sleeve. He was closer than he'd ever been before, close enough that I could see his face clearly for the first time. His skin was the color of old concrete, gray and mottled, and his eyes reflected the parking lot lights like polished coins. Where his left arm should have been, the sleeve of his shirt hung empty, but not torn or hemmed. It simply ended, as if the arm had never existed at all. But it was his smile that made me stumble backward against my car. His teeth were the color of rust, and his grin was too wide, stretching his face in ways that human expressions shouldn't. He took a step toward me, then another, and I could hear the wet sound his boots made against the asphalt. With each step, the metallic smell grew stronger, and the air around him seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. My watch had stopped again, frozen at that same impossible time, and the world had taken on that dreamlike quality that made me wonder if I was still awake. I wanted to run, to throw the cap at him and sprint back to my room, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could only stand there, pressed against the warm metal of my car, as he approached with measured, deliberate steps. When he was close enough that I could see the clay caked under his fingernails, he stopped and extended his good hand toward me. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. He asked if I'd found something that belonged to him, his eyes fixed on the cap in my hands. I tried to speak, to tell him to take it and leave me alone, but my throat had closed up. All I could manage was a nod as I held the cap out toward him. He took it gently, almost reverently, and placed it on his head. The fit was perfect, settling into place as if it had never been removed. Then he touched the bill of the cap with his fingers and gave me a nod that might have been gratitude or acknowledgement. When he turned to walk away, I noticed that his boots left no prints on the asphalt, despite the wet clay that caked their soles. I watched him disappear into the darkness between the trees, and only then did feeling return to my legs. I slammed the trunk shut and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me and pulling the chain latch into place. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by the window, watching the parking lot, but he didn't return. Morning brought no relief, only new questions that I couldn't answer. I packed my equipment with shaking hands and checked out of the motel early, telling the desk clerk that I'd had a family emergency. But as I loaded my gear into the car, I found something that made my stomach drop like a stone. At the bottom of my equipment bag, beneath the transit case, was a manila envelope I'd never seen before. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all showing me at work over the past week. Me setting up my instruments, me checking my notes, me walking the perimeter of each job site. The photos had been taken from various angles and distances, some so close that I could see the concentration on my face as I worked. But it was the last photograph in the stack that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the envelope. It showed me standing next to my car in the motel parking lot the night before, holding the navy cap in my hands, and in the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was the figure watching from the tree line. The timestamp in the corner read 9:47 p.m. I'm writing this from a different motel, 50 miles from the last job site, but I know it won't matter. The metallic smell has followed me here, seeping under the door and through the ventilation system. My watch stopped again an hour ago, the hands frozen at that same impossible time. And when I went to take a shower, I found fresh red clay circling the drain, still warm to the touch. I've called my supervisor and told him I'm quitting, effective immediately. He wasn't happy about it, threatened to blacklist me from future contracts, but I don't care anymore. Some jobs aren't worth finishing, no matter what they pay. Outside my window, the parking lot is empty except for my rental car, but I can feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the security lights. The clay under my fingernails, clay that wasn't there this morning, tells me that running won't solve this. Whatever connection I've made, whatever debt I've incurred, it's not something I can drive away from. My watch has started ticking again, but the time is all wrong. According to every clock in this room, it should be past midnight, but my watch insists it's still 9:47. Always 9:47, frozen in that moment when everything changed. I can hear footsteps in the hallway now, the wet sound of boots on carpet, and the metallic smell is so strong I can taste it on my tongue. Someone is trying the door handle, turning it slowly, testing the lock. But I'm not afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I'm finally beginning to understand. The surveyor's job is to measure the land, to establish boundaries and reference points for others to follow. But what happens when the land starts measuring you back? What happens when you become the reference point, the permanent marker that can never be moved? The door is opening now, and I can see the familiar silhouette in the gap. The flannel shirt, the navy cap, the empty sleeve. He's come to collect what's his, and I finally understand what that is. My name is written in red clay now, somewhere deep in the earth where no survey equipment will ever find it. And tomorrow, when the next surveyor sets up his instruments and adjusts his plumb line, he'll see me standing behind the fence, watching with eyes that reflect light like coins, wearing clothes that never quite fit right, carrying the scent of wet clay and rusted metal. The watch on my wrist has stopped again, but that's okay. Time is different when you're part of the landscape, when you become a permanent fixture that others will notice from the corner of their eye. 947 isn't a time anymore. It's a coordinate, a point of reference in a survey that never ends. And in my missing left hand, I'm already holding a navy cap, waiting for the next person who needs to learn the difference between measuring the land and becoming part of it. Story 7. No, the Bellevue Hotel has been my responsibility for 3 years now. Every nail, every board, every shadow that shouldn't exist. I know this Art Deco monument like the back of my weathered hands, can navigate its maze of corridors blindfolded, can identify which pipe is groaning by the pitch of its complaint. But that Tuesday night in October, walking the 7th floor with my maintenance clipboard and flashlight, I discovered that even after 1,000 late-night rounds, this place could still surprise me. The discovery happened between rooms 714 and 716, where the hallway curves slightly left to accommodate the building's original architecture. I'd always assumed the space between those doors was just structural necessity, support beams, insulation, the usual guts of an old building. But there, tucked into what should have been solid wall, stood a door I'd never seen before. Not just any door. This was original to the building, complete with the same brass handle and geometric etching that marked the Bellevue's heyday. The number plate read 715, though according to every blueprint I'd studied, every work order I'd filed, every insurance document I'd signed, that room didn't exist. The hotel's numbering jumped straight from 714 to 716, had always jumped straight from 714 to 716. My hand trembled as I turned the handle. The door opened without resistance, revealing a space that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a washroom, perfectly preserved as if the last guest had stepped out moments ago. Black and white checkered floor tiles gleamed under the amber glow of a milk glass wall sconce. A clawfoot bathtub dominated the far corner, its porcelain surface reflecting my flashlight beam like still water. The air carried the faint but distinct scent of lavender soap, sweet and clean and impossible. Everything about the room screamed authenticity. The hexagonal floor tiles bore the same manufacturer's mark as the rest of the 7th floor. The wallpaper, cream with subtle gold flourishes, matched the pattern I'd seen in the hotel's 1925 restoration photographs. Even the plumbing fixtures carried the same Art Deco styling that defined the Bellevue's character. This wasn't some modern addition or forgotten storage space. This was original construction, as much a part of the building as the cornerstone itself. I spent 20 minutes in that room, documenting every detail with my phone camera, measuring dimensions, testing the fixtures. The bathtub faucet turned easily, producing a brief sputter before releasing a steady stream of clear water. The toilet flushed with the particular gurgle of pre-war plumbing. The light switch operated a working bulb. This wasn't a sealed-off relic or a decorative facade. This was a functional room that, according to every official record, didn't exist. My notebook entry that night was brief but precise. Room 715 discovered between existing units. Investigate blueprints. Notify management. I figured it would be a fascinating footnote to the hotel's history, maybe worth a mention in the next renovation report. Old buildings held secrets, and Atlantic City's architecture was notorious for its quirks and forgotten spaces. The next evening, I returned with the new maintenance intern. eager to show him how even veteran staff could learn something new about their building. We took the service elevator to the 7th floor, walked the familiar path to the curve between rooms 714 and 716, and found exactly what the blueprints promised. Unbroken wall, no door, no brass handle, no room number plate. Just the same cream-colored wallpaper and mahogany wainscoting that lined the rest of the corridor. I ran my hands along the wall where the door had been, pressing my palms against the surface, searching for any irregularity, any sign that something had been there just 24 hours earlier. The intern watched me with barely concealed concern as I traced the outline of where I remembered the door, muttering about impossible disappearances and questioning my own memory. When I suggested we needed to check the blueprints again, he nodded with the careful politeness of someone humoring a potentially unstable supervisor. But then I remembered the thermal camera. The Bellevue's insurance company had provided us with infrared equipment 2 years ago after a series of water damage claims. Hidden pipe leaks, inadequate insulation, temperature variations that could indicate structural problems. The camera revealed things invisible to the naked eye. That's when I found the rectangle. The thermal image showed a perfect door-shaped outline of cooler temperature embedded in the warmer wall. The difference wasn't dramatic, maybe 3 degrees, but it was precise, unmistakable, and exactly the size and shape of the door I'd walked through the night before. The intern stared at the camera's screen, his skepticism shifting to something closer to unease. We measured the temperature differential from multiple angles, documenting readings that made no architectural sense. Cold spots in walls usually indicated air leaks, missing insulation, or moisture problems. But this rectangle was too uniform, too perfectly geometric. The edges were knife-sharp, as if the wall itself remembered the door that had been there. That's when I heard the dripping. Pressing my ear to the cool rectangle revealed the distinct sound of water hitting porcelain, not the steady drip of a leak, but the irregular patter of a faucet that hadn't been completely turned off. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from a space that officially didn't exist behind a wall that showed no signs of penetration. As I listened, the scent of lavender soap began to permeate the air around us. Not strongly, not obviously, but with the subtle persistence of fragrance seeping through porous material. The intern caught it too, his nose wrinkling in confusion as he looked around for the source of a scent that had no business existing in this sterile corridor. We left that night with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that the Bellevue's secrets ran deeper than hidden rooms and forgotten blueprints. I spent the following days researching the hotel's construction history, scouring city planning documents, even visiting the Atlantic City Historical Society's archives. Nothing I found explained the room that existed only sometimes, or the thermal signature that suggested physical space where none should be. The third night I returned alone. The door was back. This time I didn't hesitate. I photographed everything. The door from multiple angles, the room number, the interior with its impossible cleanliness and anachronistic perfection. I collected physical evidence. A small sliver of soap from the basin, a few drops of water from the faucet sealed in a sample bottle, even a tiny fragment of wallpaper that came loose when I ran my finger along the edge near the baseboard. But when I developed the photographs the next morning, they showed nothing but empty corridor. The sample bottles contained tap water with chlorine levels consistent with the city's municipal supply. The wallpaper fragment matched the pattern in the hallway, not the gold-flourished cream I remembered from inside the impossible room. The evidence contradicted itself. The thermal camera consistently showed the cold rectangle. My ears consistently detected the dripping water. My nose consistently registered the lavender scent that strengthened whenever I stood in that specific spot. But photographs showed nothing. Water samples proved nothing. Physical fragments supported nothing. I began visiting the 7th floor every night, sometimes finding the door, sometimes finding bare wall, but always finding the thermal signature and always hearing the water and always smelling the soap. The pattern seemed random at first. 3 nights with the door, 2 without, 1 with, 4 without. But gradually I realized the appearances corresponded to something else entirely. The door appeared when I was alone. When I brought colleagues, supervisors, or anyone else to witness the phenomenon, we found only wall. When I arrived by myself, usually late in my shift, when the hotel settled into its overnight quiet, the door waited for me like an old friend. I could enter, explore, even use the facilities if I chose. The room remained pristine, unchanging, as if existing in a bubble separate from the normal flow of time. I started keeping detailed logs, documenting not just the door's presence or absence, but my own physical and mental state during each visit. Sleep deprivation, stress levels, caffeine intake, blood pressure, mood, recent medications, anything that might explain why my perception differed from verifiable reality. The logs revealed an uncomfortable pattern. My handwriting grew increasingly erratic on nights when I found the door. My descriptions became more elaborate, more sensory, filled with details about the quality of light, the temperature of the air, the precise shade of the porcelain fixtures. On nights when I found only wall, my entries were brief, clinical, disappointed, but the thermal camera never lied. Whether I found door or wall, the rectangle remained, consistent in temperature, sharp in definition, unmistakably present in every infrared image. Something existed in that space, whether I could perceive it or not. The hotel's day manager eventually noticed my unusual interest in the 7th floor. She questioned my frequent visits, my requests for additional thermal imaging equipment, my growing collection of floor plans and historical documents. When I tried to explain about the room that appeared and disappeared, she listened with the patient expression of someone dealing with an employee under excessive stress. She suggested I take some time off, rest, maybe talk to someone. The hotel would cover counseling costs, she assured me. Maintenance work, especially night maintenance work, could be isolating and stressful. Sometimes people started seeing things that weren't there, but the things I was seeing had thermal signatures. They had consistent dimensions. They produced measurable changes in air quality and temperature. Whatever was happening on the 7th floor wasn't a simple hallucination or stress-induced fantasy. The physical evidence was incomplete but undeniable. I declined the leave offer and continued my nightly visits, but now with the knowledge that my supervisors considered my behavior concerning. The weight of that judgment added a new dimension to my investigation. Was I documenting a genuine anomaly, or was I simply documenting my own descent into obsession? The question haunted my waking hours and invaded my dreams. 3 weeks after my initial discovery, I found the door open. Not just unlocked, standing wide open, revealing the familiar washroom interior but somehow changed. The air inside felt heavier, more humid, as if the space had been sealed for decades and was finally breathing again. The lavender scent was stronger, almost overwhelming, carrying beneath it something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. The bathtub was full. Clear water filled the clawfoot tub nearly to its rim, perfectly still but somehow giving the impression of recent disturbance. Steam rose faintly from the surface, suggesting the water was warm, recently drawn, waiting for someone who would never arrive. I approached the tub cautiously, noting details that my increasingly unreliable memory might later distort. The water was indeed warm, uncomfortably so, hot enough to redden skin on contact. But there was no source for the heat. The faucet handles were cold, the pipes showed no signs of recent use, and the building's hot water system had been shut down for routine maintenance 3 hours earlier. Floating on the surface of the impossible water was a bar of soap. Lavender soap, cream-colored and carved with the same geometric pattern that decorated the door handles throughout the Bellevue. The soap appeared fresh, unwrapped, as if it had been placed there moments before my arrival. I reached for the soap without thinking, my fingers breaking the surface tension of the too warm water. The moment my skin made contact with the liquid, the entire room shifted around me like a photograph coming into focus. Colors became richer, edges sharper, details more vivid than ordinary perception should allow. The walls breathed, not metaphorically, not as a trick of imagination, but literally. The cream and gold wallpaper expanded and contracted in a slow, steady rhythm, as if the room itself were a living organism drawing breath. With each inhalation, the lavender scent intensified. With each exhalation, the underlying organic smell grew stronger, more recognizable, the smell of something that had been underwater too long. I jerked my hand from the water and stumbled backward, my vision returning to normal as the room resumed its static appearance. But the breathing continued, barely perceptible now, but undeniably present, a rhythm that matched my own accelerated heartbeat. That's when I understood that the room wasn't just impossible, it was alive. I fled the 7th floor that night and didn't return for a week. During the day, I researched the Bellevue's history with renewed urgency, searching not just for architectural anomalies, but for any record of unexplained incidents, unusual occurrences, or previous employees who might have discovered what I'd discovered. The archives yielded fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. 3 maintenance workers had quit without notice over the hotel's 70-year history, all citing personal reasons, all leaving behind reputations for reliability and professional competence. 2 guests had requested room changes from the 7th floor, complaining of strange sounds and unexplained odors. 1 former night manager had been terminated for what the records described as erratic behavior and unfounded concerns about building integrity. None of these incidents had been connected previously, scattered as they were across decades of normal hotel operations, but viewed together, they suggested a pattern of encounters with something that defied explanation, something that drove otherwise rational people to doubt their own senses. When I finally returned to the 7th floor, I brought equipment, a digital voice recorder, multiple cameras, temperature sensors, and a container of talcum powder that I scattered across the floor where the door sometimes appeared. If the room was real, it would leave footprints. If it was a hallucination, the powder would remain undisturbed. The door was there, standing slightly ajar. Inside, the washroom looked exactly as I remembered, but the bathtub was empty now, bone dry, as if it had never held water at all. The bar of lavender soap sat on the rim, still carved with its impossible geometric pattern, still carrying the scent that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I entered carefully, photographing everything, speaking continuously into the voice recorder, documenting my observations in real time. The room felt different tonight, less welcoming, more watchful, as if it were studying me with the same intensity I brought to studying it. The wallpaper wasn't breathing, but it was moving. Subtle shifts in the pattern, as if the gold flourishes were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The effect was hypnotic, drawing my attention to specific sections of the wall where the design seemed more complex, more meaningful, almost like text waiting to be decoded. I spent an hour in that room collecting samples, taking measurements, recording observations that grew increasingly elaborate as the night wore on. The lavender scent fluctuated in intensity, sometimes so strong it made my eyes water, sometimes so faint I wondered if I were imagining it. The temperature varied by several degrees from corner to corner, creating microclimates within the small space that followed no logical pattern. When I finally left, the talcum powder showed a single set of footprints leading into the room and back out again. My footprints, and mine alone. But in the morning, when I reviewed the audio recording, I heard 2 sets of footsteps. The second set was lighter, more careful, with a slightly different rhythm. They appeared on the recording approximately 10 minutes after I'd entered the room, and continued until I left. But I had been alone. I was certain I had been alone. The thermal camera I'd positioned in the hallway showed only my own heat signature entering and exiting the space. The photographs were blank again, showing nothing but empty corridor. The temperature readings were inconclusive. The samples I'd collected contained nothing but standard building materials and tap water. But the audio evidence suggested someone else had been in that room with me. Someone who left no visual trace, no thermal signature, no physical evidence beyond the sound of their presence. I played the recording dozens of times, analyzing every second for clues about the identity of my invisible companion. The footsteps were definitely human, not the skittering of rodents or the settling of old building materials. They moved with purpose, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved, as if their owner were following my investigation with professional interest. At one point in the recording, about halfway through my visit, there's a sound that might be breathing. Not my own labored respiration, but something softer, more controlled, barely audible beneath the lavender-scented silence. It's the kind of sound someone might make while concentrating intently, focusing their attention on a task that required absolute precision. The breathing stops abruptly when I speak into the recorder about the wallpaper's movement, as if my observation had been noticed and noted by someone who preferred to remain undetected. I made a decision that night to end my investigation. Whatever was happening in room 715, whatever force was creating doors that existed only sometimes and sounds that recorded but couldn't be seen, I was clearly in over my head. My behavior was becoming erratic. My sleep patterns were disrupted. My supervisors were questioning my reliability. The smart thing to do was walk away, forget what I'd seen, and focus on the parts of my job that existed in quantifiable reality. But the room had other plans. 3 days after I decided to abandon my investigation, I found myself standing outside the door to room 715 at 2 in the morning, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I remembered finishing my rounds on the 3rd floor, checking the boiler room, making my final entries in the maintenance log. The next thing I knew, I was in the 7th floor corridor, staring at the impossible door that stood open like an invitation. My hand was already on the brass handle. Inside, the room had changed again. The washroom remained the same. Checkered floor, clawfoot tub, milk glass sconce. But now there was evidence of occupancy. A towel hung on the rack behind the door, cream-colored and monogrammed with the Bellevue's Art Deco logo. The soap dish beside the sink held not just the lavender bar I'd seen before, but also a straight razor, its bone handle yellow with age, and a shaving brush with bristles still damp from recent use. The mirror above the sink reflected not just my own confused face, but something else. A shadow that moved independently of my own movements, a presence that existed only in the silvered glass. When I turned to look behind me, nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow remained, patient and still, as if it had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice it. I approached the mirror slowly, my reflection growing larger and clearer, but the shadow remained constant in size and position, occupying a space that should have been empty air. It had the general shape of a person, head, shoulders, torso, but lacked definable features. It was simply darkness given form, darkness that watched with eyes I couldn't see but could certainly feel. When I reached out to touch the mirror's surface, the shadow reached out as well, its movement perfectly synchronized with mine. Our hands met at the glass, mine warm and solid, the shadows cold and somehow yielding, as if the mirror were no longer a barrier but a permeable membrane between two different states of existence. The moment our palms connected, I felt the presence fully, not malevolent, not threatening, but profoundly sad. Lonely in a way that transcended ordinary human experience. This wasn't the loneliness of isolation or abandonment, but something deeper, more fundamental. The loneliness of being forgotten, of existing in spaces between the real and unreal, acknowledged only by those who were themselves beginning to slip away from conventional reality. I understood then that I wasn't discovering room 715. I was becoming part of it. The realization should have terrified me, should have sent me fleeing back to the safety of the measurable world. Instead, it felt like coming home. The breathing walls, the impossible water, the lavender-scented air that carried whispers of lives lived and lost. All of it made perfect sense from this new perspective. I wasn't investigating an anomaly. I was being recruited into one. I pulled my hand away from the mirror and back toward the door, but the shadow didn't release me. It followed, stretching across the glass surface, reaching toward the edge of the frame as if trying to escape its silvered prison. When I reached the threshold, it pressed against the mirror's boundary, its form distorting with the effort of trying to cross from reflection into reality. I ran, down the corridor, past the service elevator, down 7 flights of stairs, through the lobby, out into the Atlantic City night where the air smelled of salt and decay instead of impossible lavender. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment 6 blocks away, where I locked the door and tried to convince myself that what I'd experienced was nothing more than stress, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination. But my reflection in the bathroom mirror carried a shadow that moved independently of my own movements. I called in sick the next morning and didn't return to the Bellevue for a week. When I did go back, it was to submit my resignation. The day manager accepted it without surprise. mentioning that my recent behavior had been concerning and that perhaps a change of environment would be beneficial for everyone involved. I left Atlantic City that weekend, taking a maintenance job at a modern office complex in Philadelphia, where everything was measured, documented, and explained by architectural necessity. No Art Deco mysteries, no impossible rooms, no doors that existed only sometimes, just fluorescent lights, climate control systems, and predictable mechanical failures that could be diagnosed and repaired according to established procedures. But I brought the shadow with me. It's always there now, in every reflective surface. Mirrors, windows, puddles after rain, even the black screen of my turned-off television. Not threatening, never threatening, but present, constant, patient. Sometimes I catch myself talking to it, explaining my daily routine, sharing observations about the building I maintain, the people I work with, the simple problems that have simple solutions. The shadow listens. I'm certain it listens, and sometimes when I'm alone in the basement boiler room or walking the empty corridors after hours, I hear it respond, not with words, but with sounds that might be breathing, footsteps that might be following, the distant drip of water from a faucet that doesn't officially exist. I've stopped trying to determine whether the shadow is real or imaginary. The distinction has become meaningless. What matters is that I'm no longer alone in the spaces between the real and unreal, the documented and impossible, the rational and mysterious. I found my place in the breathing walls and impossible rooms that exist in the margins of ordinary reality. Or perhaps they found their place in me. Either way, I'm no longer afraid of the questions that have no answers, the doors that exist only sometimes, the rooms that remember occupants who were never there. I've learned that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only inhabited, and I've made peace with the fact that I may never know the difference. Tonight, in my new building with its sensible architecture and explainable systems, I've noticed something interesting. There's a supply closet on the third floor that doesn't appear on any of the blueprints, tucked between the elevator bank and the emergency stairwell. It's probably just an oversight in the documentation, a forgotten space that was sealed off during renovation and never properly recorded. But when I press my ear to the door, I hear the familiar sound of water dripping onto porcelain, and the air around the handle carries just the faintest hint of lavender soap. The thermal camera should arrive tomorrow. Story 8. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and I'd made plenty in my 38 years, but none quite like choosing this particular canyon for my solo survival exercise. A week alone in Nevada's Mojave, with nothing but basic gear and whatever skills the Corps had beaten into me 15 years ago. Day 3 found me setting up camp in a narrow gorge where rust-colored walls rose like cathedral spires, blocking cell towers and GPS satellites alike. The isolation should have felt familiar. Instead, something crawled beneath my skin as shadows deepened and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in as many minutes. I built my fire close to the western wall, where an overhang provided shelter from the wind that howled through the canyon like something wounded. The flames cast dancing shadows on stone that bore strange scratches, parallel grooves running vertically down the rock face, too regular to be natural erosion, too deep to be made by any animal I knew. Sleep came fitfully. The desert night carried sounds that didn't belong, whispers beneath the wind, the scratch of movement on stone, and something else, something that made my old radio training prick at the edges of consciousness. At 0347 hours, I jerked awake. My internal clock remained military precise, even years after discharge, but precision couldn't explain what pulled me from sleep. A voice, distant and distorted, calling through the canyon like an echo searching for its source. Ketchum, Ketchum. My surname, repeated with the mechanical persistence of someone learning pronunciation. The accent was wrong, not quite human, as if vocal cords were being manipulated by something unfamiliar with their operation. I lay motionless in my sleeping bag, breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The fire had died to embers, casting barely enough light to distinguish rock from shadow. Logic demanded I attribute the sound to wind through stone formations, but 17 years of military service had taught me to trust instincts over logic when survival was at stake. Victor 77. Come back. My blood turned to ice water. Victor 77, my old call sign from deployments I'd spent years trying to forget. No one had used that designation in over a decade. No one alive knew I was here. The voice came again, clearer now, originating from somewhere deeper in the canyon where the walls narrowed to an impassable bottleneck. It spoke English like a second language learned from intercepted transmissions, each syllable carefully constructed but somehow wrong. Return. The trail waits. I forced myself to sit up, joints protesting in the cold. My headlamp sat within arm's reach, but something kept me from switching it on. The same instinct that had kept me breathing through 3 tours in places where the wrong light at the wrong time meant body bags. The voice fell silent, but the canyon didn't. Rocks shifted somewhere in the darkness, a grinding sound like massive weight being redistributed. Then came something else. Movement without footsteps, a sliding whisper against stone that shouldn't exist in an environment where every pebble created an avalanche of sound. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The beam cut through darkness like a blade, illuminating rough canyon walls, scattered boulders, and nothing else. But 30 yards away, where the gorge curved sharply to the left, something stood at the edge of my light's reach. Tall, impossibly tall, stretching nearly to where the canyon walls converged overhead. The figure possessed human proportions elongated beyond natural limits, arms hanging at its sides with fingers that extended past where knees should have been. No features were discernible at this distance, just a black silhouette against slightly less black stone. It didn't move like anything I'd encountered. No shifting weight from foot to foot, no subtle sway of a body maintaining balance. It simply existed in space, as stationary as the rock formation surrounding it. I kept the light trained on the figure and called out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed off canyon walls, returning distorted and hollow. The figure remained motionless, offering no response. But as seconds stretched into minutes, I noticed something that made my throat constrict. It cast no shadow. My headlamp beam struck the figure directly, yet no darkness fell across the canyon floor behind it. The light seemed to pass through it entirely, leaving the ground uniformly illuminated as if nothing stood there at all. I blinked hard, squeezed my eyes shut, and opened them again. The figure remained. "I'm armed," I called, though my sidearm lay in a gear bag 6 feet away. The lie produced no reaction. The figure continued its impossible stillness until, without warning, it began to move. Movement implied the wrong word entirely. The figure didn't walk or step or shift position. It glided backward, maintaining its orientation while sliding away from me deeper into the canyon. No sounds accompanied this retreat, no scrape of feet against stone or rustle of clothing. It simply receded like water flowing uphill, growing smaller until darkness swallowed it completely. I kept my light aimed where it had disappeared for another 20 minutes, heart hammering against my ribs with combat zone intensity. Only when my hand began to shake from muscle fatigue did I finally lower the beam. Sleep remained elusive for the rest of the night. Every wind-borne sound became approaching footsteps, every settling rock an indication of something stalking through the darkness beyond my fire's protective circle. I dozed fitfully until dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust. Morning brought the harsh clarity that desert sunlight provides. My campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. No signs of intrusion, no evidence that anything had disturbed the night except wind and my own imagination. The rational mind reasserted itself, offering explanations for phenomena that darkness had made sinister. Altitude and dehydration could produce hallucinations. Stress from isolation might manifest in auditory and visual disturbances. The figure could have been a rock formation that shadows and tired eyes had anthropomorphized into something threatening. But rational minds don't explain everything. I broke camp methodically, packing gear with the muscle memory of countless field exercises. Yet as I prepared to leave, something drew my attention to the area where the figure had stood. Footprints, not human tracks. These impressions were longer and narrower, with deep grooves at what would have been the toe positions. But their orientation defied logic. Each print pointed toward me, as if whatever made them had been facing in my direction while moving away. I knelt beside the clearest impression, studying details that made my scalp crawl. The depth suggested significant weight, yet the prints showed no sign of the forward momentum that walking requires. Instead, they appeared to have been carved into hard-packed sand by something dragging itself backward while maintaining forward orientation. More disturbing were the claw marks. Deep scratches scored the canyon walls at shoulder height, running parallel to the footprint trail. Whatever had made them possessed considerable reach and strength enough to gouge solid rock. The marks extended around the bend where the figure had vanished, continuing deeper into the canyon's narrowing passage. I followed the trail for perhaps 50 yards before the walls closed too tightly for a human to pass, but the claw marks continued, disappearing into crevices that would challenge a snake's ability to navigate. Standing in that increasingly narrow space, surrounded by stone that seemed to press inward with each breath, I felt watched. Not the general paranoia that isolation brings, but the specific certainty that something observed me from concealment. Every shadow held potential threat. Every crack in the rock might hide something that shouldn't exist. The feeling intensified as I retreated to my original campsite. Whatever had visited during the night hadn't departed. It had simply withdrawn to a safer distance. The knowledge crawled along my spine like ice water, raising every instinctual alarm that evolution had provided. I shouldered my pack and left the canyon at a pace that military training would classify as tactical withdrawal. But distance provided no relief from the sensation of being followed. Every few hundred yards, I turned to check my back trail, finding nothing but empty desert and the canyon mouth receding behind me. By noon, the highway came into view. 2 lanes of sun-baked asphalt that represented civilization and sanity. My truck waited where I'd left it, covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. The keys felt substantial in my hand, a tangible connection to the rational world I'd temporarily abandoned. But as I loaded my gear, the feeling of being observed returned with renewed intensity. I scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but sagebrush and distant mountains. Yet the certainty remained. Something watched from concealment, patient and persistent as a predator evaluating prey. I drove 60 miles before the sensation finally faded, leaving me alone with questions that rational thought couldn't answer. The voice calling my old designation, the shadowless figure, the backward-oriented footprints, each element defied explanation, yet remained vivid in memory with the clarity that truth provides. The official report I filed with the Survival Training Organization mentioned equipment malfunctions and early termination due to weather conditions. No mention of voices in the night or impossible visitors. Such things belonged in psychiatric evaluations, not operational summaries. But 3 weeks later, the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly, more like intercepted transmissions from somewhere I'd never been. Desert landscapes that looked familiar but wrong, canyons that twisted in geometries that hurt to contemplate, and always the voice calling through frequencies that didn't exist on any spectrum I knew. Victor 77, the trail waits. I purchased recording equipment and left it running through each night, hoping to capture something that would prove the dreams were more than imagination. But the devices registered only silence, as if whatever transmitted those messages operated on wavelengths that technology couldn't detect. Weeks became months. The dreams grew more frequent, more detailed. I began to recognize landmarks in those impossible landscapes, rock formations that corresponded to real places I'd visited during 20 years of outdoor recreation. But in the dreams, these familiar locations harbored passages that led deeper than geology should allow, tunnels that descended beyond the reach of light or sound. Research provided no comfort. Historical records mentioned similar phenomena throughout Nevada's remote areas. Voices calling names that no one should know, figures that cast no shadows, trails that led places where no trails should go. Indigenous accounts spoke of entities that existed in spaces between the real and the imagined, beings that fed on isolation and uncertainty. But research couldn't explain why these entities knew my call sign, my name, my location during that survival exercise. It couldn't explain the physical evidence I'd found or the persistent certainty that something had tried to lead me somewhere I wasn't meant to return from. 6 months after the canyon incident, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my military service. I stopped sleeping in remote areas. No more solo camping, No more survival exercises, no more time spent alone in places where cell towers couldn't reach. The rational mind provided justifications about getting older, losing interest in roughing it, preferring comfortable accommodations. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Something was still out there, patient and persistent, calling my name through frequencies that existed just beyond human perception. It had found me once in a narrow canyon where shadows didn't behave according to natural law. And despite every rational explanation I could construct, some part of me remained certain that it was still looking. The dreams continued, each one offering glimpses of deeper passages and longer trails. In them, I sometimes saw myself accepting that original invitation, following the voice into narrow spaces where the walls pressed close and the darkness was absolute. In those dreams, I never emerged. I told myself that imagination was playing tricks, that stress and isolation had produced a psychological episode that lingered in memory like an untreated infection. But on quiet nights when the wind sounded like whispers, I found myself checking locks twice and sleeping with every light in the house burning bright, because somewhere in the back of my mind, barely audible above the noise of civilized life, I could still hear it calling. Victor 77, the trail waits. And on the worst nights, the part of me that remembered 3 tours in places where impossible things happened on a regular basis wondered if the next time it called, I might not be strong enough to ignore the invitation. Story 9. The realtor had mentioned the basement only once, almost as an afterthought, while I signed the lease papers in his air-conditioned office. Sealed and replaced with a concrete slab years ago, he'd said, waving his hand dismissively. Foundation issues. Nothing to worry about. The house sat on the outskirts of Tucson, where the desert began its slow crawl toward the mountains, and the rent was reasonable enough for a contractor between jobs. I should have asked more questions. The first night, I attributed the settling sounds to the age of the place. A modest ranch-style home built sometime in the 70s, all exposed beams and burnt orange carpet. The air conditioning wheezed through metal ducts that snaked beneath the floorboards, carrying the desert heat away in mechanical gasps. Every house had its personality, its particular symphony of creaks and hums. This one seemed no different. The voice came 3 days later. I'd returned from a frustrating day trying to land a kitchen renovation job, my work boots heavy against the linoleum as I dropped my tool belt beside the refrigerator. The house felt hollow around me, that peculiar emptiness of a space not yet claimed. I was reaching for a beer when I heard it, muffled, distant, but unmistakably clear. "Hey there, Wrench." My hand froze on the refrigerator handle. Wrench. Nobody had called me that since Denver, since the crew I'd worked with on high-rise projects where precision mattered more than speed. The guys who'd given me the nickname when they'd seen me coax life from stripped bolts and seized machinery. That was 8 months ago, and I'd left Colorado without forwarding addresses or long goodbyes. The voice had emerged from the air return vent near the kitchen sink, that rectangular grate where cool air whispered up from the depths of the house. I knelt beside it, pressing my ear to the metal slats, but heard only the distant hum of the air handler somewhere in the utility room. "Hello?" My voice felt strange in the empty kitchen, too loud and too thin at once. For a moment, nothing. Then my own word came drifting back through the ductwork. "Hello?" But wrong somehow, stretched and hollow, followed by a faint metallic tick that raised goosebumps along my forearms. I spent the evening checking the HVAC system, following the main trunk line from the air handler through the crawlspace access panel. The ducts ran beneath the house in a logical pattern, silver arteries carrying conditioned air to every room. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain a voice traveling through metal channels, or why it would know a name I'd tried to leave behind. That night, I lay in the unfamiliar bedroom listening to the house breathe around me. The air conditioning cycled on and off with mechanical precision, but between those intervals, in the deep quiet of the desert night, I thought I could hear something else. A distant murmur, too faint to understand, like voices in another room of a hotel bleeding through thin walls. Morning brought rationality with the harsh Arizona sun. Air ducts could play tricks with sound, I told myself. Neighbors' conversations carried through shared walls. Radio signals sometimes bled through metal installations. There were explanations for everything if you looked hard enough. But when I checked the attic access panel above the hallway, I found it slightly askew. The square of drywall shifted perhaps 2 inches from its frame. I didn't remember opening it. The realtor certainly hadn't mentioned any reason to access the attic space during our brief walkthrough. I pushed the panel aside and hoisted myself up into the narrow space above the ceiling joists. The attic was exactly what I'd expected. Insulation batting, electrical runs, and the silver bulk of ductwork snaking toward the various rooms below. Hot, dusty, and unremarkable. But as I maneuvered toward the kitchen area, I noticed something that made me pause. The air return duct, the one that connected to the grate where the voice had emerged, showed wear marks around its exterior. Not the usual dust patterns you'd expect in an attic, but streaks in the accumulated grime, as if something had recently moved against the metal surface. More troubling were the marks themselves, elongated smears that looked almost like fingerprints, but wrong in their proportions. Too long, too narrow, pressed into what might have been some kind of grease or oil. I spent the afternoon researching the house's history at the county recorder's office, telling myself I was being thorough, not paranoid. The property had changed hands several times over the past decade, which wasn't unusual for rental properties. Previous tenants had included a retired couple, a single mother with teenagers, and a graduate student from the university. Nothing dramatic in the public records. No police reports. No insurance claims related to structural damage. The basement had been sealed in 2019 according to the building permits. Foundation settling had caused cracks that allowed moisture intrusion during the monsoon seasons. The solution had been to fill the space with concrete and install the HVAC system in a more conventional crawlspace configuration, standard procedure for desert construction. But that evening, as I prepared a simple dinner in the kitchen, the voice returned. "How was your day, Wrench?" This time I was ready for it. I knelt immediately beside the air return, pressing my face close to the grate. The voice seemed to emanate from deep within the ductwork, traveling upward through metal pathways that shouldn't have contained any living thing. "Who's down there?" I called into the vent. The response came after a pause, my own words echoing back with that same distorted quality, but mixed now with something that might have been laughter, a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire, metallic and strained. I grabbed a flashlight and returned to the attic, this time bringing a screwdriver to remove the air return duct entirely from the kitchen ceiling. The beam of light revealed exactly what I'd expected, a rectangular opening that dropped down into the main trunk line, which continued toward the air handler in the utility room. No space large enough for a person, no branching pathways that might lead to hidden areas. Yet when I called down through the opening, my voice echoed strangely, bouncing off metal surfaces in patterns that seemed too complex for the simple ductwork layout I could see. And when I listened carefully, I could swear I heard something moving in the darkness below, a subtle shifting that might have been thermal expansion in the metal, or might have been something else entirely. The next morning brought another displaced attic panel and fresh marks on the air return duct. This time, the greasy prints were more pronounced, and they extended further along the metal surface, as if something had been pulling itself through the narrow space between the ductwork and the ceiling joists. I took photographs, though I wasn't sure what I intended to do with them. During the day, I found myself listening constantly for sounds beneath the floor. The house's normal settling seemed more pronounced now, every creak and pop potentially significant. I began to notice patterns, subtle thuds that seemed to move through the structure, following pathways that might have corresponded to the old basement layout. The realtor had said the space was filled with concrete, but maybe pockets remained, gaps where the fill hadn't completely displaced whatever had been there before. That afternoon, I called the property management company. The woman who answered sounded professionally cheerful, but her tone shifted slightly when I mentioned the previous basement. She'd need to check with the owner about historical details, she said. The house had been renovated several times, and documentation from earlier modifications might not be readily available. Could she call me back? She didn't call back. Evening brought the voice again, but this time it seemed closer, more immediate. Instead of the distant, hollow quality I'd grown accustomed to, the words seemed to emerge from multiple points throughout the house. The bathroom vent, the bedroom air return, the living room register. Getting settled in, wrench. I moved from room to room, pressing my ear to each grate. But the voice seemed to shift location as I did, always coming from the vent I wasn't monitoring. When I responded, my words came back from several directions at once, creating an overlapping echo that made my own voice sound like a crowd of people speaking in unison. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with my back against the refrigerator, watching the air return vent and listening for any sound that might indicate movement within the walls. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what might have been breathing, slow, measured exhalations that seemed to come from deep within the structure of the house itself. I began to research voice transmission through HVAC systems, learning about acoustic properties of sheet metal and the ways sound waves could travel through complex ductwork configurations. Crosstalk between units, I discovered, could sometimes carry conversations from neighboring properties. But this house sat on a large lot, with the nearest neighbor more than 100 yards away, and the voice knew details about my life that no casual eavesdropper should have possessed. Over the following days, the interactions became more frequent and more specific. The voice would comment on my job search, mentioning companies I'd contacted and interviews I'd scheduled. It seemed to know when I'd had disappointing conversations with potential employers, offering sympathy in that same slow, grave tone that never quite sounded entirely human. Tough break with the shopping center job, wrench. That foreman seemed like a real piece of work. Don't let them grind you down. I began to wonder if I was somehow talking to myself, if the isolation and job stress were creating auditory hallucinations that my mind was elaborating into conversations. I'd read about such things. People under extreme pressure sometimes developed internal dialogues that became externalized, projected onto their environment as a coping mechanism. But that didn't explain the physical evidence. The displaced attic panels continued to appear with metronomic regularity. The greasy prints on the ductwork multiplied and spread, forming patterns that suggested systematic exploration of the space above my ceiling. And occasionally, I would find small objects moved from where I'd left them. A wrench shifted slightly on the kitchen counter. A coffee cup rotated to face a different direction. My work boots repositioned beside the front door. I installed a motion-activated camera in the attic, positioning it to monitor the air return duct where the markings were most pronounced. The first night's footage showed nothing unusual, just grainy infrared images of insulation and metal. But the camera was found the next morning lying on its side, the memory card missing. The voice seemed amused by my investigative efforts. Getting creative up there, wrench. Technology's not always the answer. Some problems are older than cameras. I began to spend more time away from the house, lingering at coffee shops and job sites, anything to avoid the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to thicken each evening as the sun dropped behind the desert mountains. But the voice had established a hold on my routine, and I found myself returning each night with a mixture of dread and anticipation, as if I were meeting an old friend whose company had become both necessary and toxic. The conversations grew more personal. The voice would ask about my family, my plans, my reasons for leaving Colorado. It seemed genuinely interested in my responses, offering commentary that was often surprisingly insightful. But there was always something slightly off about its observations, as if the speaker understood human behavior from a theoretical perspective, but lacked direct experience with it. Families can be complicated. Starting over takes courage. Sometimes running away is the same as running toward. I began to research the house's construction more thoroughly, obtaining architectural plans from the city building department. The original basement had been substantial, nearly the full footprint of the house, with concrete walls extending 8 feet below grade. The 2019 renovation had indeed filled the space, but the plans showed a more complex operation than the realtor had described. Drainage systems had been installed to handle groundwater, and several utility chases had been left open to accommodate future access needs. Most intriguingly, the architectural notes mentioned preservation of existing tunnel access for utility maintenance. The tunnel wasn't detailed in the plans, but a notation indicated it connected to a utility easement that ran beneath the neighboring properties. I spent a day trying to locate this tunnel, following the property lines and looking for access points that might correspond to the architectural notes. Behind the house, near the eastern property line, I found a concrete collar set flush with the ground and covered by a heavy metal grate. It was partially concealed by desert vegetation, and the grate showed signs of recent disturbance, scratches around the locking mechanism and oil stains on the concrete. When I knelt beside the grate that evening, I could hear the familiar hum of air circulation, but also something else. A sound that might have been movement within the underground space, and beneath that, barely audible, what sounded like voices in conversation. Not the single voice I'd grown accustomed to, but multiple speakers engaged in some kind of discussion too distant and muffled to understand. I called down through the grate but received no response. Whatever conversations were taking place in the tunnel seemed unaware of my presence, or chose not to acknowledge it. That night, the voice in the house seemed different, more urgent, more present. Instead of the slow, measured cadence I'd grown accustomed to, it spoke more quickly, with an undertone that might have been concern. "You've been exploring, Wrench. Some places are better left undisturbed. Not everything that's buried should be dug up." I pressed the voice for explanations, demanding to know who was speaking and how they'd gained access to the sealed space beneath the house. But my questions were returned to me in that familiar, distorted echo, now accompanied by additional sounds, scratching, shifting, what might have been multiple sources of breathing from different locations within the ductwork. The next morning, I found every attic access panel in the house displaced, and the greasy prints had multiplied exponentially. They covered not just the air ducts, but the ceiling joists, the electrical conduits, and even the underside of the roof decking. The pattern suggested systematic movement through the entire attic space, as if something had been mapping every inch of the area above my head. I called a locksmith and had additional security installed, deadbolts, window locks, motion sensors, but the modifications felt futile, since whatever was happening seemed to occur within the structure of the house itself, in spaces I couldn't effectively secure. The voice seemed to understand my increasing paranoia. "Locks won't help, Wrench. We're not coming from outside. We've always been here." The use of "we" chilled me more than anything that had come before. The idea of a single presence lurking in the sealed basement had been disturbing but manageable. Multiple entities suggested something more complex, more organized, and infinitely more threatening. I began to consider the possibility that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, that the stress of relocation and unemployment had triggered a psychological episode that was manifesting as increasingly elaborate auditory and visual hallucinations. The alternative, that the house actually contained some kind of inhabitants living in spaces that shouldn't have existed, seemed impossible to accept. But then I found the photographs. They were tucked beneath my pillow when I returned from a job interview, printed on standard photo paper and showing images I had no memory of taking. They depicted the interior of the house from unusual angles, low perspectives, as if the camera had been positioned near floor level or within the walls themselves. The images showed me going about my daily routine, but with details that suggested they'd been taken over a period of weeks, documenting behaviors and patterns I hadn't realized I'd developed. In one photograph, I was standing in the kitchen, apparently listening to the air return vent. But the image showed something I couldn't have seen at the time, a subtle distortion in the metal grate, as if something were pressing against it from the inside. Another image captured me sleeping, but the angle suggested the photograph had been taken from within the bedroom wall, through some opening I couldn't identify. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed the concrete grate I'd discovered behind the house, but instead of being flush with the ground, it was raised slightly, revealing a dark opening beneath. And positioned around the opening, barely visible in the shadows, were what appeared to be several human figures in various states of concealment. I studied the image with a magnifying glass, trying to determine if the shapes were actually people or simply shadows and debris that resembled human forms. The resolution was too poor to be certain, but the positioning seemed too deliberate, too organized to be accidental. That evening, I confronted the voice directly, demanding explanations for the photographs and the increasingly invasive surveillance I seemed to be experiencing. But instead of responses, I received only my own words echoed back with that metallic distortion, now accompanied by sounds that seemed to come from throughout the house. Footsteps above the ceiling, movement within the walls, what might have been breathing from behind the baseboards. I packed my belongings that night, loading everything into my truck while the house seemed to watch from every window and vent. The voice followed me from room to room, offering commentary on my departure preparations. Leaving so soon, Wrench? The lease isn't up for months. Where will you go? I didn't answer. I'd learned that responses only encouraged longer conversations, and I no longer trusted my ability to distinguish between what was real and what might be products of my increasingly unstable mental state. As I carried the last of my tools to the truck, I noticed lights in the windows of the house. Not the electric lights I'd been using, but a softer, more diffuse glow that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. The illumination pulsed gently, like the breathing of some vast organism, and through the windows I could see shapes moving in the rooms I'd just vacated. I drove away without looking back, but in my rearview mirror, I saw the house settling into darkness as the distance increased. The last thing visible was the faint glow from the air return grates, as if something inside were still trying to communicate across the growing space between us. I never returned to collect my security deposit. 6 months later, living in a cramped apartment in Phoenix and working steady construction jobs, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph showing the interior of my current apartment, taken from an impossible angle within the HVAC duct above my new kitchen. On the back, written in careful block letters, was a single word: wrench. The air conditioning system in this building is older, more complex, with ductwork that connects units throughout the structure. On quiet nights, when the desert wind dies down and the city settles into silence, I sometimes hear voices traveling through the metal pathways, distant conversations, fragments of lives lived in parallel spaces, and occasionally, a familiar greeting that seems to know more about my daily routine than any chance encounter should. I've stopped responding to the voices. I've learned that some conversations are better left unfinished, some questions better left unasked. But late at night, when I'm lying awake listening to the building breathe around me, I sometimes wonder if I'm the only one hearing these transmissions from the spaces between spaces, or if others are receiving similar visits from whatever lives in the sealed and forgotten places of the world. The lease on this apartment runs for another 8 months. After that, I think I'll try somewhere without central air conditioning. Somewhere where the only voices I hear are the ones I'm certain belong to the living. But I suspect it won't matter. Some things, once they've found you, don't let distance or relocation break the connection they've established. They follow through pathways that exist outside normal geography, through networks of metal and concrete that stretch beneath the surface of every place humans think they've made safe. And sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet and the air system cycles through its mechanical breathing, I think I can hear them down there. Not just the familiar voice, but others as well, comparing notes about the people they've chosen to observe, sharing information across vast underground networks that connect places and lives in ways we never intended. The voice was right about one thing. Some problems are older than cameras, older than understanding, older than the civilizations we've built to protect ourselves from the things that were here first, waiting in the spaces we thought we'd sealed away forever. I keep my new lease agreement in the truck, ready for the next time I need to move quickly. But I'm beginning to suspect that no matter where I go, there will always be voices in the ducts, always something watching from the spaces we can't see, always the possibility that the next house I rent will have its own sealed basement and its own patient residents waiting to welcome me home. Story 10. I wake with sweat coating my skin like a second layer, my fingers cramped around something hard and angular. The bedroom feels smaller than when I'd fallen asleep, walls pressing inward with each labored breath. In my grip, a picture frame, its silver edges digging into my palm. The photo inside shows a man in a dark suit, his face bearing the angular features of my father's side. Uncle Theodore, a name whispered at family gatherings but never explained. I don't remember taking this from the moving boxes. The digital clock on my nightstand glows 3:47 a.m., the exact time scrawled on a yellow post-it note I'd found stuck inside my old agenda weeks ago. No context, no explanation, just those numbers in my own handwriting that I couldn't recall making. The coincidence sends a chill down my spine that has nothing to do with the morning air. As I shift to place the frame on the nightstand, something snags on my thumbnail. A thread, fine as spider silk, caught in the frame's corner. I hold it up to the dim light filtering through the blinds, and my stomach lurches. The thread is identical to the fabric of Uncle Theodore's suit in the photograph. The same weave, the same deep charcoal color. It shouldn't be possible. The photo is decades old, taken long before my birth. Yet here's a piece of that same fabric, somehow attached to a frame that's been packed away in cardboard boxes for months. I pull the thread free, watching it drift to the floor like a feather. When I look back at the photo, Uncle Theodore's eyes seem more pronounced, as if the slight shift in lighting has brought him into sharper focus. His gaze appears to follow me as I move toward the dresser. The house settles around me, creaking in ways it never has before. Each sound feels deliberate, timed to my movements. I place the frame face down on the dresser and step back, but the weight of unseen observation presses against my shoulders. The feeling that I'm not alone in this room grows stronger with each passing second. I retreat to the kitchen, hoping coffee will wash away the lingering unease. The moving boxes still litter the living room, a maze of cardboard and packing tape that transforms familiar furniture into strange, looming shapes in the darkness. This house was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where I could finally escape the claustrophobic weight of my family's history. Instead, it feels like that history has followed me here, seeping through the walls like moisture. The coffee maker gurgles to life, its mechanical rhythm providing the only comfort in the oppressive silence. I lean against the counter, trying to rationalize what just happened. Stress, I tell myself. The move, the new job, the isolation of living alone for the first time in years. It's all catching up to me. People find things they don't remember packing all the time. The thread was probably from my own clothing, a coincidence magnified by an overactive imagination. But even as I construct these logical explanations, the sound system in the living room clicks on with a soft electronic hum. I freeze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. I didn't set a timer. I haven't even connected it to power yet. Or so I thought. The radio crackles through static, searching for a signal, before settling on a station playing what sounds like an old jazz standard. The music is distant, as if coming from underwater, but the lyrics are clear enough to make my blood run cold. The singer repeats a name over and over, weaving it into the melody with haunting repetition. Whitmore, Whitmore, in the shadows he'll stay. Whitmore, Whitmore, at the break of day. Whitmore, my family name, my surname that appears on no popular songs, no radio hits, no jazz standards from any era I know. Yet here it is, broadcasting through my speakers at nearly 4 a.m, as if the radio waves themselves have been waiting for this moment. I set the mug down with shaking hands and move toward the living room. The music continues, that voice crooning my family name with an intimacy that makes my skin crawl. I reach for the power button, but before my fingers can make contact, a draft sweeps through the house with sudden, violent force. Every door in the hallway slams shut in rapid succession. Bedroom, bathroom, closet, each one closing with a definitive click that echoes through the darkness. Every door except one. The office at the end of the hall remains open, its threshold framed in pale moonlight that seems brighter than it should be. The radio falls silent. My heartbeat thunders in my ears as I stare down that hallway, every instinct screaming at me to run, to grab my keys and drive until this house is nothing but a memory. But something stronger than fear pulls me forward, a compulsion that feels both foreign and familiar, as if I'm following a path I've walked before in dreams. Each step toward the office feels like walking through water. The air grows thicker, more resistant, and the temperature drops with every foot of distance I cover. The hardwood floor creaks beneath my bare feet, but the sound seems to come from somewhere else, as if I'm hearing the footsteps of someone walking parallel to me, just out of sight. The office doorway looms ahead, and I pause at the threshold. The room is exactly as I left it when I moved in. Empty bookshelves, a desk pushed against the far wall, boxes stacked in the corner waiting to be unpacked. Except now, centered perfectly on the desk's surface, sits the picture frame. The same frame I left face down on my bedroom dresser. Uncle Theodore stares back at me from across the room, his expression unchanged, but somehow more intense, as if the photograph has gained depth and dimension during its impossible journey from one room to another. The glass surface reflects the moonlight streaming through the window, but the reflection seems wrong. Too bright, too focused, like a spotlight drawing attention to details I hadn't noticed before. I approach the desk slowly, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. Up close, I can see things in the photograph that weren't visible before, or perhaps weren't there at all. Behind Uncle Theodore, in the blurred background of what appears to be this very house, shapes move in windows that should be empty. Shadows that don't correspond to any objects in the frame shift and writhe as I watch, as if the photograph is not a static image, but a window into a living scene. Uncle Theodore's hands, folded in his lap in the classic pose of formal photography, now seem to grip something. The shadow between his fingers suggests the outline of another photograph, as if he's holding a picture within a picture. When I lean closer, squinting to make out the details, I swear I can see my own face reflected in his eyes. The temperature in the room plummets, my breath begins to mist, and frost starts forming on the window glass with impossible speed. The house creaks and settles around me, but now the sounds follow a pattern. 3 short creaks, then 2 long ones, repeated like a code, like someone tapping out a message. I reach for the frame with trembling hands, intending to turn it face down, to break whatever spell has settled over this room. But the moment my fingers touch the glass, the photograph changes. Uncle Theodore is no longer alone. Standing beside him, translucent but unmistakably present, is another figure. A man I recognize from old family portraits, though I can't recall his name. And behind them, more shapes emerge from the shadows of the photograph. Faces I've seen in albums and heard mentioned in whispered conversations. Relatives I was told had died before I was born. Family members whose names were spoken only in hushed tones and quickly changed subjects. They're all looking directly at me. The frame grows warm in my hands, then hot, but I can't let go. My fingers seem fused to the glass as the photograph continues to populate itself with figures from my family's past. They don't move in the traditional sense. They simply appear, materializing from the darkness like they've been waiting there all along, waiting for me to look closely enough to see them. Uncle Theodore's lips move. No sound emerges from the photograph, but I understand what he's saying with a clarity that bypasses my ears entirely. He's calling my name. Not shouting, not whispering, but speaking it with the patient repetition of someone who has been trying to get my attention for a very long time. The other figures begin to speak as well, their mouths moving in silent unison, and suddenly I realize they're not calling to me at all. They're warning me. Their expressions aren't welcoming. They're urgent, desperate, trying to communicate something vital across the barrier between their world and mine. Behind me, the office door creaks. I spin around, still clutching the frame, to find the door slowly swinging shut. No wind, no draft, no logical explanation. Just the steady, inevitable movement of wood and hinges sealing me inside this room with the impossible photograph and its growing collection of family ghosts. The door closes with a soft click, and the lock turns by itself. I'm alone with them now. These figures from my bloodline who exist only in silver and shadow. The photograph continues to evolve, revealing deeper layers of the past, showing me faces I've never seen but somehow recognize. People who share my features, my bone structure, the same angular jaw that runs through generations of family portraits. Uncle Theodore raises his hand in the photograph, pointing at something behind me. I turn to look, and there, reflected in the office window, I see them all, not as photographic images, but as translucent figures standing in the room with me. They surround me in a circle, their faces bearing expressions of profound sadness, mixed with something that looks like relief. They've been waiting for me to come home. The realization hits with the force of a physical blow. This isn't my house. It's theirs. It's always been theirs. The building I thought I was buying, the fresh start I believed I was making, the escape from family history I desperately sought, all of it an illusion. I haven't been unpacking my belongings into a new home. I've been unpacking into their tomb. The photograph in my hands grows heavier, its frame warming to match my body temperature as if it's becoming part of me. Uncle Theodore no longer points at the window. Now he's pointing at me, and his mouth forms words I can finally hear. Not through my ears, but through some deeper channel that connects me to every person who has ever carried the Whitmore name. "Your turn to hold the frame," he says, his voice echoing from decades past. "Your turn to wait." The office door opens by itself, revealing the hallway beyond. But it's not the same hallway I walked down minutes ago. The walls stretch farther now, the ceiling hangs lower, and doors line both sides in numbers that don't match the house's actual layout. Behind each door, I sense movement. The restless stirring of family members who have been waiting in rooms that exist only for them. Spaces carved out of memory and longing, and the peculiar magnetism that holds bloodlines together across time and death. I understand now why I found that post-it note with the time written on it, why the thread from Uncle Theodore's suit clung to my nail, why the radio played songs that shouldn't exist. They've been preparing me, creating these small impossibilities to accustom me to larger ones, softening the boundary between rational and supernatural, so that when the moment came, I would be ready to step across. The frame in my hands feels like an anchor now, connecting me to every generation of Whitmores who have stood in this room, who have held this same photograph, who have felt the weight of family history settling around them like sediment. I'm not the first to experience this moment, and I won't be the last. In the photograph, Uncle Theodore smiles, the first expression change I've witnessed. It's not a malevolent smile, but it's not entirely reassuring either. It's the smile of someone sharing a secret, letting me in on a truth that's been hidden for decades. The Whitmore family never really leaves home. We just take turns being the one in the photograph, waiting for the next generation to find their way back. I look at my reflection in the window, and for just a moment, I see myself as I will appear to whoever finds this frame next. Translucent, urgent, trapped between silver and shadow, holding memories that refuse to stay buried. The hallway beckons, and I know that if I step through that doorway, I'll find rooms I've never seen but somehow remember. Spaces where other family members wait to welcome me into whatever existence they've carved out for themselves in this house that's simultaneously real and impossible, present and past, home and purgatory. My reflection in the window wavers, becoming less solid with each passing second, while my image in the photograph grows clearer, more defined. I'm becoming part of the frame, part of the endless cycle of Whitmores, who return to this house when their time comes, who find themselves unpacking belongings they don't remember packing, waking up with frames in their hands and impossible threads under their fingernails. The border between the photograph and reality blurs, until I can no longer tell which side of the glass I'm on. Uncle Theodore extends his hand toward me from within the frame, and I reach out to take it, feeling the cool touch of someone who has been waiting decades for this moment. As our fingers meet, I understand that I'm not disappearing. I'm finally coming into focus, joining the collection of Whitmores who exist in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps between logical explanation and supernatural truth. Guardians of a family history that refuses to let its members truly leave home. The frame grows warm in my hands as I settle into my place within the photograph, and somewhere in the distance, I hear the sound of boxes being unpacked by unfamiliar hands, the rustle of someone discovering belongings they don't remember packing. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. I am home now, waiting for the next member of our family to find their way back to us, to hold the frame and feel the impossible thread catch beneath their fingernail, to hear their name sung on radio stations that shouldn't exist, and to walk down hallways that stretch longer than any house should allow. I am Uncle Theodore now, and Theodore was someone else before, and that someone was another before them, each of us taking our turn in the photograph, each of us waiting with infinite patience for the next Whitmore to understand that some families never really let you go. They just change the nature of how you belong to them. The frame settles into my hands with the weight of decades, and I smile the same smile Uncle Theodore showed me, preparing to wait for as long as it takes for the next generation to find their way home. Story 11. The fluorescent lights in Riverside Manor cast their sickly pallor across linoleum floors that had witnessed decades of shuffling slippers and whispered final words. I'd been working the graveyard shift for 8 months now, long enough to know which floorboards creaked, which residents wandered at 3 a.m., and which shadows belonged where they fell. Long enough to convince myself that the job was just about medication schedules, bathroom assistance, and the occasional bout of confused wandering. That was before room 237 started keeping me awake during my days off. The woman in 237 had arrived 3 weeks ago, transferred from some facility upstate that had closed suddenly. No family visits, no personal effects beyond a small suitcase and that brass clock she insisted stay on her nightstand. The intake forms listed her name, but she never responded to it. Staff just called her Mrs. G, though she rarely acknowledged that either. What she did acknowledge, with disturbing consistency, was time itself. Every night, without fail, she would mutter the same phrase, "Not today." Sometimes she'd repeat it dozens of times like a prayer or a ward against something invisible. The day shift mentioned it. The evening shift complained about it. But during my rounds between midnight and dawn, she would lie perfectly still, lips moving soundlessly, the words hanging in the air like incense. Tonight felt different from the moment I clocked in. The autumn cold had settled deep into Vermont's bones, and the manor's old heating system wheezed and rattled with unusual vigor. My supervisor mentioned that Mrs. G had been more agitated than usual during dinner, refusing to eat and staring out her window at the empty parking lot with an intensity that made the nurses uncomfortable. "Keep an eye on her," she'd said, though I always did. Room 237 had become an obsession I couldn't quite explain to myself. The first few hours passed normally. Mr. Peterson in 201 needed help to the bathroom twice. Mrs. Chen in 215 was having one of her restless nights, humming old Chinese lullabies until I brought her warm milk. By 2:30, the building had settled into its familiar rhythm of snores, whispered dreams, and the steady tick of medication schedules. That's when I heard it. Not the usual muttered "not today," but something else entirely. Clear words, spoken with purpose and unmistakable recognition. I was making my rounds, approaching room 237 with the measured steps I'd perfected to avoid waking light sleepers, when her voice cut through the hallway silence. "You're late, as always." I froze. The words were spoken with the warm familiarity of someone greeting an old friend, tinged with gentle reproach. But Mrs. G never spoke to anyone with warmth. She barely acknowledged the existence of staff members, treating us like ghosts moving through her peripheral vision. I pressed closer to her door, which stood slightly ajar as always. Regulation required it for safety checks. The room beyond was bathed in that peculiar blue glow that snow-heavy clouds cast through windows, and I could see her clearly. She was sitting upright in bed, smiling, actually smiling, at something I couldn't see. The old brass clock on her nightstand ticked steadily, its hands pointing to 2:47 a.m. Odd. The clock had always run slow, consistently behind by 10 or 15 minutes. I'd noticed because timing medication was crucial, and I'd learned not to rely on it. "I know you don't like the cold," she continued, her voice carrying that same gentle warmth. "But you never were good at judging time." My radio crackled softly on my belt, the sudden static making me jump. Standard check-in from the security office, but when I reached for it, Mrs. G turned toward the door. Our eyes met through the gap, and her smile widened. "He's here now," she said, though she was looking directly at me. "Right where you said he'd be." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. My badge, clipped to my shirt pocket, began to vibrate against my chest with a soft, rhythmic pulse. Electronic malfunction, I told myself, though it had never done that before in all my months here. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, following protocol for welfare checks. Mrs. G, are you feeling all right? Do you need anything? She turned back to face the window, her smile fading into that familiar, distant expression. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then she spoke again, this time in her usual flat tone. Not today. The brass clock showed 2:52 a.m. 5 minutes had passed, though it felt like I'd been standing there much longer. I made a note in my logbook about checking on Mrs. G and continued my rounds, but the encounter left me unsettled in ways I couldn't articulate. The next 3 hours dragged. Every creak of the building's settling frame made me look over my shoulder. Every whisper of wind against windows sounded like footsteps in distant corridors. My badge continued its subtle vibration, a sensation so faint I began to question whether I was feeling it at all. At 4:15, Mrs. Chen's room alarm went off. She'd gotten up alone and fallen trying to reach the bathroom, something that happened occasionally with residents who forgot their mobility limitations. I spent 20 minutes helping her back to bed and filling out incident reports, grateful for the distraction. When I finally made it back to complete my rounds, room 237 was quiet. Too quiet. I knocked softly and peered inside, expecting to find Mrs. G in her usual restless sleep. Instead, I found an empty bed, covers pulled tight with hospital corners. Not a wrinkle or depression to suggest anyone had been lying there. The armchair by the window was still moving, not swaying dramatically, but with that subtle back and forth motion of something recently vacated. The kind of movement you'd see if someone had just stood up and walked away. But Mrs. G was nowhere in the room. The bathroom was empty, door standing open. The small closet held only her few belongings, untouched. I checked the hallway, thinking she might have wandered. The manor had security measures for this, door alarms, motion sensors, but nothing had triggered. I radioed the security office, keeping my voice carefully neutral. This is second floor. I need to report a missing resident. Room 237. The response crackled back immediately. Copy that. We show all residents accounted for. Mrs. G is logged as in her room. I stared at the empty bed, the still moving chair. I'm looking at room 237 right now. She's not here. A pause. Then, hold on. Let me check the system again. Another pause, longer this time. Shows Mrs. G swiped into her room at 11:43 p.m. and hasn't swiped out. Are you sure you're in the right room? The brass clock on the nightstand read 4:31 a.m., its hands moving with steady precision. For the first time since Mrs. G had arrived, it was running fast. Not just a few minutes, but a full 10 minutes ahead of my watch. Ahead of the hallway clocks, ahead of every other timepiece in the building. I backed out of the room, skin crawling with the sensation of being watched by empty air. My badge had stopped vibrating, but now I could swear I heard something else. The soft shuffle of slippers in the hallway behind me. When I turned, the corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit by the same buzzing fluorescence that had witnessed this scene countless times before. Mrs. Chen was calling from her room. Nurse? Nurse, there's someone in the hallway. I hurried to her door, found her sitting up in bed, pointing toward the window that faced the inner courtyard. There, she said, walking back and forth. Been doing it for 10 minutes. The courtyard was empty. Snow covered the ground in unmarked drifts, and the security lights showed nothing moving except bare tree branches in the wind. But Mrs. Chen kept pointing, kept insisting someone was there. Old woman in a nightgown, she said, walking like she's looking for something. I stayed with Mrs. Chen until she settled back to sleep, then returned to room 237. This time, Mrs. G was there, lying in bed as if she'd never left, breathing with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. The chair by the window was still. The brass clock read 4:47 a.m., still 10 minutes fast. I completed my rounds in a haze of growing unease, checking and rechecking each room, each resident. Everything appeared normal. No other alarms, no other incidents, just the persistent feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the building's carefully maintained routine. At 6 a.m., the day shift arrived. I gave my report, mentioning Mrs. G's brief confusion, but nothing else. How could I explain the empty room, the moving chair, the impossible timing of events that security logs contradicted. The day nurse nodded sympathetically. Night shift often brought strange encounters with confused residents. I drove home through Vermont's gray dawn, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about Mrs. G's smile, about her words to someone I couldn't see. The way she'd looked at me and said, "He's here now," as if my presence had confirmed something she'd been expecting. That evening I returned to work with a mixture of dread and fascination. Mrs. G was in her room, sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. When I knocked, she turned toward me with that same distant expression. "Not today," she said, then looked back at the window. The brass clock on her nightstand showed the correct time, running neither fast nor slow. But as I watched, its second hand seemed to hesitate between ticks, as if time itself was holding its breath. I left her door ajar, as regulation required, and continued my rounds. The building felt different now, charged with an expectation I couldn't name. My badge lay still against my chest, but I found myself checking it constantly, waiting for that strange vibration to return. It was going to be a long night. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like my own whispered the question I'd been avoiding. What if Mrs. G wasn't confused at all? What if she'd been waiting for someone who never came when he was supposed to? Someone who was always late. Someone who moved through the world just out of sight, but close enough to make clocks run fast and chairs rock gently in empty rooms. The fluorescent lights flickered once, casting strange shadows down the hallway, and I realized I was no longer sure whether I was the observer in this story, or simply another piece in a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering whatever tracks might have been left in the courtyard, erasing evidence of paths walked by feet I couldn't see. Story 12. The golden hour was dying when I arrived at the Whitmore estate, casting long shadows across the overgrown meadow that surrounded the Victorian farmhouse. My client had been specific about the timing, sunset photography only, when the light would catch the ornate woodwork just right. What he hadn't mentioned was how the isolation would settle into your bones like morning frost, or how the wind through the broken shutters would sound almost conversational. I'd photographed dozens of historic properties across Pennsylvania, but something about this place made my camera strap feel heavier against my neck. The house sat like a patient predator, all gingerbread trim and weathered clapboard, its windows reflecting the dying light in ways that suggested eyes watching from within. The realtor's lockbox hung from the front door handle, numbers worn smooth by decades of fingers that had long since turned to dust. The interior welcomed me with that particular smell of old houses. Not quite decay, but the accumulated breath of generations. Dust motes danced in the amber light streaming through the tall windows, and my footsteps echoed against hardwood floors that creaked in a rhythm I couldn't quite identify. The first floor yielded the expected treasures. A parlor with original horsehair plaster, a kitchen dominated by a cast-iron stove that could have fed an army, and a dining room where the wallpaper, hand-blocked roses on cream, had aged to the color of old blood. I worked methodically, adjusting my tripod and checking light meters, but found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The house felt occupied, not by presence, but by absence, as if someone had just stepped out of frame moments before I raised my camera. My digital display showed nothing unusual, just empty rooms, heavy with history and shadow. The staircase to the second floor rose before me like a mouthful of wooden teeth. Each step groaned under my weight, and I noticed how the sound seemed to echo from above. Not quite an echo, more like an answer. The banister felt warm under my palm despite the dropping temperature outside. Upstairs, the light grew stranger. The setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and rust, but patches of shadow seemed to move independently of their sources. I set up my equipment in what had once been the master bedroom, noting how the floorboards here showed different wear patterns than downstairs. Deeper grooves, as if from pacing, and scuff marks that looked fresh despite the dust coating everything else. That's when the doors began their conversation. The first slam came from down the hallway, sharp, decisive, like someone had thrown their full weight behind it. I paused in adjusting my white balance, listening to the silence that followed. Old houses settle, I told myself, especially wooden ones responding to temperature changes. But when the second door slammed, then a third, each one closer than the last, settling seemed like wishful thinking. I walked to the hallway with my light meter in hand, more for comfort than necessity. The corridor stretched away from me, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar, as if holding their breath. No windows here, no source for the drafts that might explain what I'd heard. The air hung still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of something I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but wrong somehow, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The boot prints appeared as I walked back toward my equipment, clear impressions in the dust that carpeted the floor. Size 11 or 12. Deep tread suggesting work boots, leading from the head of the stairs to the wall at the far end of the hallway. But the wall was solid. I'd checked the blueprint the realtor had provided, and there was no door there, no closet or alcove. Just Victorian wallpaper, more of those faded roses, and the boot prints ending as if their owner had simply walked into the pattern and disappeared. I knelt to examine them more closely, noting how sharp the edges were, how the dust around them showed no signs of settling. Fresh prints, recent enough that particles still clung to the air above them, visible in the slanted light from the bedroom behind me. I'd been alone in this house for less than 30 minutes. My hands trembled slightly as I returned to my camera, but I forced myself to continue working. Photography had always been my anchor, the mechanical process of f-stops and shutter speeds grounding me in the tangible world. Through my viewfinder, the room looked normal enough. Dusty furniture shapes beneath white sheets, afternoon light painting everything in sepia tones. But the wallpaper moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that would convince anyone looking at the printed photograph later. Just a subtle rippling, as if a breeze were moving behind the paper, making the rose patterns shift and breathe. I lowered my camera and stared directly at the wall. Perfectly still. Raised the camera again, focused through the lens, and there it was. That gentle undulation, like curtains stirred by wind from a window that wasn't there. I approached the wall with the slow deliberation of someone testing ice on a questionable pond. The paper felt solid under my fingers, properly adhered despite its age. But as I pressed my palm flat against the roses, I felt something that made my breath catch. Not movement, but warmth. Body warmth. As if someone were standing on the other side with their hand pressed to match mine. That's when I heard the furniture. The sound came through the wall clearly enough that I jerked my hand back. Chairs scraping against wood floors, something heavy being dragged across the room. I pulled out my phone and activated the voice recorder app, holding it close to the wallpaper. The dragging sound came again, accompanied by what might have been footsteps, definitely coming from the space beyond the wall. But according to the blueprint, there was no space beyond the wall. The exterior wall of the house ran directly behind this one, with maybe 18 inches of cavity for insulation. Not enough room for furniture, certainly not enough for whatever I was hearing move around in there. I pressed my ear to the wallpaper and closed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sounds had a pattern. Footsteps, then dragging, then a pause, then repetition, like someone moving furniture according to a very specific plan, or perhaps moving the same piece over and over again, unable to find the right position for it. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, my breath beginning to mist in front of my face despite the warm September evening outside. I checked my watch. 7:30. Still had maybe 20 minutes of decent light left, but the urge to pack up and leave was growing stronger with each passing moment. I forced myself to finish the bedroom, taking shots from multiple angles, adjusting for the increasingly dim light. But I kept finding my attention drawn back to that section of wallpaper, watching for movement that never came when I looked directly at it. Only through the camera lens did the roses seem to stir. Only in my peripheral vision did they dance. The sounds from beyond the wall continued sporadically, sometimes furniture, sometimes footsteps, once what sounded distinctly like a door closing. I recorded everything, though I doubted any of it would show up clearly on the audio file. These old houses had a way of swallowing sound, of making you question what you'd actually heard. By the time I'd finished documenting the upstairs rooms, the light outside had faded to deep blue, and the house had settled into an expectant quiet. I packed my equipment with hands that wanted to move faster than my brain thought-wise, double-checking that I hadn't left anything behind. The thought of having to return here, even in daylight, made my chest tight. The descent to the first floor felt longer than the climb up had been, as if the staircase had somehow added steps while I worked. Each creak of the board seemed amplified in the growing darkness, and I found myself counting them involuntarily. 17, 18, 19, more than I remembered from the ascent. I was almost to the bottom when I heard my name, not called out, not shouted, but spoken in a conversational tone, as if someone were mentioning me to a third party. A voice I didn't recognize, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I stood frozen on the stairs, gripping my camera bag, straining to hear it again. But the silence that followed was absolute, so complete that it seemed to have weight. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Wind through broken boards, the settling of old timber, my own overwrought nerves. But logic felt fragile in that moment, like ice over deep water. I quickened my pace toward the front door, no longer caring about the careful professionalism I usually maintained on shoots. The lock on the door stuck for a moment that felt like an hour, my fingers fumbling with the mechanism while the darkness behind me seemed to press closer. When it finally turned, the cool evening air rushed in like salvation, carrying the normal sounds of the world. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere across the fields, the whisper of wind through the tall grass. I was halfway to my car when I saw the clothesline. It stretched between two posts behind the old barn, exactly where it should have been according to the property survey. But hanging from it, swaying gently in the evening breeze, were photographs. My photographs, printed on professional paper, still damp from the developing process, showing every room I'd just finished documenting. I approached them with the sick fascination of someone examining a car accident, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The images were perfect, better than perfect, actually. The composition was flawless, the lighting exactly what I'd been trying to achieve. But these weren't digital prints from my camera. These were traditional darkroom prints, developed with chemicals I hadn't brought, on paper I didn't use, showing images I hadn't yet downloaded from my memory card. I pulled one of the prints from the line with trembling fingers, noting how the emulsion was still soft, the way it gets when photos are pulled from the developer too quickly. This one showed the master bedroom, taken from an angle I'd used, but the image showed something I hadn't seen through my viewfinder, a figure standing in the corner, partially hidden by shadow, wearing what looked like work boots. The second print showed the hallway with the boot prints, but in this version, the prints continued beyond where they'd ended on the wall. In the photograph, they seemed to lead through the wallpaper itself, as if the wall were transparent, into a space that glowed with strange light. Each successive print revealed more details I hadn't captured, hadn't seen, showing the house as something alive and inhabited, showing spaces that shouldn't exist, and figures that couldn't be there. The final print, still dripping developer solution onto the grass below, showed me standing in the master bedroom with my back to the camera, unaware that I was being photographed, unaware of the other figure in the frame, tall, indistinct, standing close enough behind me that they could have reached out and touched my shoulder. I dropped the photograph and stepped backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations that wouldn't come. Someone was playing an elaborate trick. Someone had been in the house before me, had photographed my movements, had somehow developed and hung these prints while I worked. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew it wasn't possible. I'd been alone in that house. Completely, absolutely alone. Or had I? The memory of warmth through the wallpaper came back to me. The sound of my name spoken in the darkness. The feeling of being watched that had followed me through every room. I looked back at the Victorian house, now silhouetted against the deepening sky. Its windows dark except for one on the second floor, where a pale light flickered like candlelight. I'd turned off all the lights before leaving. standing there in the growing darkness, surrounded by impossible photographs that documented my afternoon from perspectives I'd never taken. I felt my grip on certainty begin to slip. The rational world, the one where old houses were just old houses and shadows were just shadows, seemed suddenly fragile, like wallpaper that might ripple if you looked at it through the right lens, at just the right angle, revealing something moving underneath. I gathered the photographs, not knowing why but unable to leave them hanging there, and walked back to my car on unsteady legs. The drive home passed in a blur of yellow headlights and radio static, my mind cycling through explanations that grew more desperate with each mile. At home, I spread the impossible prints across my darkroom table under the red safe light, examining them with a loop-like evidence from a crime scene. The detail was extraordinary, better than my camera was capable of producing, showing textures and shadows with a clarity that seemed almost hyper-real. But it was the angles that bothered me most, the perspectives that suggested the photographer had been standing in impossible positions, sometimes appearing to float near the ceiling, sometimes shooting through solid walls. I compared them to the images on my camera's memory card, finding perfect matches for some shots, complete mysteries for others. The digital files showed empty rooms, dust dancing in afternoon light, shadows that fell where they should, normal photographs of a normal house, exactly what I'd seen through my viewfinder. But the prints told a different story entirely. As I worked through the night, examining and re-examining every detail, I began to notice something that made my hands shake. In several of the prints, in reflections caught in windows and mirrors, in shadows that seemed just a little too dark, I could see myself. Not just the obvious shot of me working in the bedroom, but fragments. My reflection in a dusty mirror, my shadow on a wall, my silhouette passing by a window. But in every case, I wasn't alone. There was always something else in the frame, always another shadow, another reflection, another presence just at the edge of perception, as if whatever had taken these photographs wanted me to know that I'd never been alone in that house, that every moment I'd thought myself isolated, I'd actually been part of a strange, ongoing conversation between the living and something else. The last print I examined stopped my heart entirely. It showed me standing at my car, just moments before I'd driven away, holding the wet photographs in my hands exactly as I had. But the angle was wrong. The shot had been taken from inside the house, from an upstairs window, looking down at me in the barn lot. I could see the confusion on my face, the way I'd held the prints up to examine them in the fading light. Someone, or something, had been watching me discover the photographs, had been documenting my shock and confusion with the same methodical precision I'd used to document the house's interior. The watcher had become the watched, the photographer had become the subject, and the line between observer and observed had blurred beyond recognition. I sit here now in my darkroom, surrounded by these impossible images, trying to write down everything that happened before the details begin to fade. But as I write, I keep thinking about that voice in the darkness, the way it had spoken my name with such casual familiarity, about the warmth through the wallpaper and the sounds of furniture being moved in rooms that didn't exist. Most of all, I think about the figure in the work boots, the one whose prints led to a wall that might not have been solid after all, whose presence filled every room even when I couldn't see them directly. I wonder if they're still there, in that Victorian farmhouse, arranging and rearranging their furniture, waiting for the next photographer to arrive at sunset with a camera and an appointment to document the interior spaces. The chemicals in my darkroom have a sharp, familiar smell, but tonight there's something else underneath. Something floral and faint, like roses left too long in stagnant water. And when I look at my hands under the red safe light, they appear to be stained with developer solution, though I haven't been printing anything. Outside my window, the morning light is beginning to creep across the horizon, but in my peripheral vision, the wallpaper seems to ripple slightly, as if stirred by a breeze that isn't there. I don't look at it directly anymore. I've learned that some things reveal themselves only when you're not quite paying attention, only when you're focused on something else entirely. The phone is ringing. It's probably another client, another historic property that needs documenting, another appointment for sunset photography in an empty house. I should answer it. Photography is my livelihood after all, and one strange afternoon shouldn't change that. But my hands won't quite reach for the receiver because I keep thinking about those boot prints, about how they seem to continue through the wallpaper into spaces that shouldn't exist, about how, in the final photograph, the one showing me at my car, there might have been a second set of prints leading away from the house, leading toward my car, leading toward me. The phone has stopped ringing, but I can hear something else now. The faint sound of furniture being moved, chairs scraping against hardwood floors, coming from somewhere in my own house, somewhere just beyond the wall of my dark room, in a room that doesn't appear on any blueprint I've ever seen. Story 13. The desert teaches you to listen, not just to the radio frequencies crackling through the dry air, but to the silence between transmissions, to the way the sand shifts when no wind moves it, to the spaces where sound should be, but isn't. After 3 months at Outpost Echo 7, I'd learned these lessons well. Too well, perhaps. The radio tower stood 40 feet above our small compound, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the endless sky. My shift began at 2200 hours every Tuesday through Thursday, a ritual of climbing the metal ladder to the observation deck where our primary communications array hummed with distant voices. Base command, supply convoys, patrol units, all of them threading through the static like electronic ghosts, their words sometimes clear, sometimes fractured by atmospheric interference. That particular night started no different from the others. The temperature had dropped from its daytime peak of 110 degrees to a more manageable 85, the kind of heat that settles into your bones and makes you forget what cool air feels like. I climbed the ladder with practiced ease, my boots finding each rung automatically in the darkness, the familiar weight of the radio pack bouncing against my back. The observation deck was a metal platform barely 6 feet square, surrounded by a waist-high rail that did little to combat the sensation of floating in empty space. During daylight hours, you could see for miles in every direction. Nothing but sand, rock formations that looked like monuments to forgotten gods, and the occasional scrub brush clinging to life. At night, the darkness pressed in close, transforming the desert into an ocean of black possibility. I settled into the folding chair we'd dragged up months ago, adjusted the headset, and began the evening's check-ins. Alpha 3 came through first, their convoy 3 hours southeast, reporting all clear. Bravo Station responded with a burst of static-laden confirmation of weather conditions. Delta Patrol checked in from their position near the dried riverbed we called Ghost Creek, their transmission so weak I had to strain to catch their coordinates. Everything normal, everything routine. The kind of night that makes you comfortable, that lets your guard down just enough to miss the first signs that something has shifted in the world around you. The wind started at 23:47 hours. I remember the exact time because I was logging Delta Patrol's final transmission when the first gust hit the tower. Not unusual. Desert winds could spring up without warning, bringing dust devils and temperature swings that made the metal structure creak and sway. But this wind was different. Cold. Not the natural coolness of a desert night, but something that seemed to crawl up from underground spaces, carrying with it the scent of places where sunlight never reaches. My uniform, designed for desert heat, offered no protection against the sudden chill that seeped through the fabric and settled into my skin. The wind didn't howl or whistle as desert winds typically do. Instead, it moved with an almost deliberate silence, like a held breath being slowly released. The communication cables began to vibrate with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. I was reaching for my jacket when the tower lurched. Not the gentle sway of wind resistance, but a sharp, violent shake that sent my coffee mug sliding across the metal surface of the equipment table. Before I could react, the sound of twisting metal screamed from below. The ladder, the bolts holding the mounting brackets to the tower supports had somehow loosened, and the entire structure was pulling away from the main frame. The crash echoed across the desert floor 40 feet below, a metallic death rattle that seemed to go on far longer than physics should have allowed. I leaned over the rail, squinting into the darkness, and could just make out the twisted ladder lying in the sand like the skeleton of some prehistoric creature, stranded. The thought should have triggered immediate concern, standard protocol, radio calls to base for assistance. Instead, I found myself strangely calm, almost detached from the reality of my situation. The cold wind continued to move around me, and I noticed that the camouflage netting we'd strung around the tower's upper supports was loosening, the carefully tied knots somehow undoing themselves as I watched. The netting fell away in sections, drifting down like enormous spider webs to drape themselves across the compound below. Without the netting's familiar presence, the tower felt exposed, vulnerable, as if some protective barrier had been stripped away to leave me naked against the night. I turned back to the radio, intending to report the situation, but found only static bleeding from the speakers. Not the usual electromagnetic interference, but something deeper and more organic, like the sound of ocean waves heard from underwater. I adjusted the frequency, checked connections, went through the troubleshooting procedures that had become second nature. Nothing. Just that endless breathing static. Then I heard my own voice. It came through the speakers with a clarity that made my skin crawl. My own words from perhaps 10 seconds earlier. Base command, this is Echo 7. We have a situation at the tower. But I hadn't spoken those words. I hadn't keyed the microphone. I had been listening to static, adjusting dials, when my voice emerged from the radio with perfect fidelity. I grabbed the microphone, keyed it, and spoke carefully. Base command, Echo 7. Radio check. How copy? Silence. Then, 10 seconds later, my own voice again. Base command, Echo 7. Radio check. How copy? The delay was exact. 10 seconds. As if my words were traveling somewhere, being processed by something, and then returned to me like an echo from the bottom of a deep well. I spoke again, this time trying a different phrase. Delta Patrol, this is Echo 7. Please respond. 10 seconds of static, then, Delta Patrol, this is Echo 7. Please respond. My voice, but somehow not quite right. The intonation was perfect, the pacing identical, but there was something underneath it, a quality I couldn't identify, as if someone were doing a nearly perfect impression of me, missing only some essential element that made the words truly mine. I set the microphone down with trembling hands and tried to think logically about what was happening. Equipment malfunction. That had to be it. Some kind of feedback loop caused by the tower's movement. The fallen ladder creating an unexpected ground path that was routing my transmissions back through the system. It made sense. It had to make sense, but the cold wind hadn't stopped, and it was getting stronger. The dogs started then. The local pack that roamed the area around our outpost, scavenging what they could from our trash and generally staying just far enough away to avoid trouble. They'd been a constant presence since we'd established the base, their distant howling a soundtrack to desert nights. Some of the men found them unsettling, but I'd grown accustomed to their voices, even found them comforting in their predictability. Now they were howling with an intensity I'd never heard before. Not the casual vocalizations of animals marking territory or calling to each other, but something desperate and afraid. The sound rose and fell in waves, coming from multiple directions, as if the entire pack were surrounding the compound. Their voices layered over each other, creating harmonics that made my bones ache. I tried the radio again. This time I simply keyed the microphone and said one word, help. 10 seconds of static. 10. Then my own voice saying help, with exactly the same inflection, the same desperate undertone I hadn't realized was there until I heard it played back to me. Then something else came through the speakers. Not my voice this time, but something that might have been words if words could be made of static and electronic noise. The sounds pulsed with a rhythm that almost seemed like speech, like someone trying to communicate through a medium they didn't fully understand. I found myself leaning closer to the speakers, straining to make sense of the alien syllables. The dogs stopped howling. All of them, at exactly the same moment. The silence that followed was so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like water pressure. In that silence, I became aware of my own heartbeat, my own breathing, the small sounds my body made simply by existing, sounds that seemed enormous in the emptiness. I don't know how long I sat there listening to nothing, waiting for something to break the spell of silence. Time moved differently in that space between the dog's last howl and whatever came next. The cold wind continued to move around me, but I was no longer certain it was actually wind. It felt more purposeful now, more aware, as if something were circling the tower just beyond the edge of perception. The radio crackled once, a brief burst of normal static, and I lunged for the microphone with desperate hope. But before I could speak, my own voice came through the speakers again. Calm. Just that one word, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never said it. Not into the microphone, not to myself, not at any point during the night. Yet there it was, my voice, telling me to be calm with an authority I didn't recognize. I stood up so quickly the folding chair toppled backward through the rail, disappearing into the darkness below. The sound of it hitting the ground came several seconds later, but from a direction that made no sense given the tower's orientation, as if the ground itself had moved while I wasn't paying attention. Looking out over the compound, I could see the fallen netting draped across buildings and equipment like burial shrouds. The latter lay twisted in the sand, its metal rungs catching what little starlight managed to penetrate the desert sky. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should, except for the growing certainty that I was being watched by something that understood the importance of appearing normal. I began checking my equipment systematically, looking for some rational explanation for what was happening. The radio showed all normal readings, power levels steady, antenna connection secure, frequency settings exactly where they should be, no indication of the kind of feedback loop that might explain the voice echoes, no atmospheric interference that might account for the 10-second delay. The watching sensation grew stronger, not from any particular direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the night itself had developed consciousness and was focusing its attention on my small island of light, 40 feet above the desert floor. I found myself moving more carefully, conscious of being observed, analyzed, judged by something whose criteria I couldn't begin to understand. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the eastern horizon in shades of amber and rose, I felt as if I were surfacing from deep water. The oppressive weight of the night's events began to lift, replaced by the familiar comfort of daylight and rational thought. The wind died away completely, leaving the air still and already warming with the promise of another scorching day. The rescue party arrived at 0800 hours, having received our emergency beacon when I'd failed to check in at the scheduled times. They brought a new ladder, replacement netting, and a mechanic to inspect the radio equipment. Everything checked out perfectly. No malfunction, no explanation for the problems I reported. The latter failure was attributed to metal fatigue, a predictable result of desert conditions and temperature cycles. I submitted my report, detailing the equipment failures and communication difficulties, but left out the stranger elements. The voice echoes, the watching presence, the unnatural wind, things that sounded like symptoms of isolation psychosis or heat exhaustion when examined in the harsh light of military logic. But as I climbed down from the tower that morning, something caught my eye on the platform's highest step, the metal grating where the ladder's top rung should have connected. Scattered across the surface were dozens of seed shells, the empty husks of some desert plant I couldn't identify. They were arranged in small, deliberate piles, as if someone had been eating and carefully disposing of the waste. The ladder had been down for 8 hours. The platform was 40 feet off the ground. No one else had been up there. I mentioned the seed shells to the mechanic, who shrugged and suggested they might have been blown up by the wind. But I had felt that wind, had been surrounded by it for hours, and I knew it hadn't carried anything with it except cold and watching silence. That was 6 weeks ago. I've worked 17 more radio shifts since then, each one proceeding without incident. The equipment functions perfectly, communications are clear, and the dogs howl at their usual distance with their usual casual indifference. Everything has returned to normal, except for the seed shells. Every morning after my shift, I find them on the highest step of the ladder, different types now. Sometimes the thick husks of cacti seeds, sometimes the papery remains of desert flowers, occasionally shells from nuts that don't grow within 100 miles of our location. Always arranged in neat little piles, always positioned precisely where someone would sit if they were waiting. I've started arriving early for my shifts, climbing the tower in daylight to check for any sign of how the shells get there. The platform is always empty. I've stayed late, watching the compound through binoculars from ground level, looking for movement around the tower base. Nothing. Yet the shells continue to appear, night after night, like offerings or messages I'm not equipped to understand. The other men have noticed my attention to the tower, my habit of checking and rechecking equipment that works perfectly. They suggest rotation to a different assignment, time away from the isolation of night watch. Standard procedure for personnel showing signs of stress, but I can't leave, not yet. Because sometimes, in the small hours between midnight and dawn, I catch myself listening for something in the radio static, something that might be words, might be breathing, might be the sound of someone very patiently waiting for me to understand. And sometimes, when the desert wind picks up and the tower sways just slightly, I think I hear my own voice whispering through the speakers. Calm. Just stay calm. I've never said those words into the microphone. I'm certain of it. Almost certain. But certainty, I've learned, is just another word for the moment before you realize how little you actually know about the world you're living in. The shells are still there this morning. Fresh ones, arranged in patterns that might mean something if I could just figure out the code. Tomorrow night, I'll climb that ladder again, settle into my chair, and wait for whatever's been waiting for me to finally make itself clear. After all, the desert teaches you to listen, and I'm beginning to suspect I haven't been listening carefully enough. Story 14. The afternoon light stretched long across the Potomac when I first heard it. That distant humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, threading between the boxwood hedges like breath held too long. I'd been volunteering at the historic gardens for 3 months, and nothing had prepared me for the way sound could travel through those manicured corridors, how it could seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The last tour group had scattered 20 minutes earlier, their chatter dissolving into the humid air as they wandered toward the river overlook. I should have been collecting the scattered pamphlets, checking the greenhouse locks, preparing for the groundskeeper's final rounds. Instead, I found myself frozen beside the central fountain, listening to something that shouldn't exist. The humming wasn't quite human, too steady, too deliberate. It moved through the garden's geometric pathways with purpose, following the same route I'd walked dozens of times with visitors. When I turned toward the sound, it seemed to shift, always staying just beyond my line of sight, just around the next corner of precisely trimmed hedge. My footsteps crunched against the gravel as I followed it, past the rose arbor where thorns caught the dying sunlight like scattered glass. The melody, if it could be called that, remained constant, a tuneless murmur that reminded me of someone walking alone, lost in thought, humming unconsciously to fill the silence. But the paths were empty. They had to be empty. The greenhouse stood at the garden's heart, its Victorian glass panels catching the amber light like a jewel box. I'd unlocked it that morning, checked the humidity sensors, ensured the rare orchids received their filtered sunlight. Everything had been normal then, predictable, safe. Now, as I approached the structure, something was wrong with the glass itself. The panels were fogged from the inside, which wasn't unusual. The controlled environment often created condensation. But these weren't random patterns of moisture. They were shapes, deliberate marks, fingerprints. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, pressed against the interior surface at different heights, different angles. Some small, some large, all clearly human. The prints created a strange constellation across the glass, as if someone had been trapped inside, pressing their hands against every panel, searching for a way out. My pulse quickened as I fumbled for the greenhouse key. The logical explanation sat heavy in my mind. Maintenance workers, perhaps, or the head gardener checking on something urgent. But no one had mentioned entering the greenhouse today, and the fingerprints looked fresh, the glass still fogged around their edges. The key turned easily, too easily. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking bone. Inside, the air hung thick and sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and something else. Something organic and slightly sour that I couldn't identify. The fingerprints were even more pronounced from this side, and I could see now that they weren't random. They formed a pattern, a trail that led from panel to panel, circling the entire interior of the greenhouse in a methodical spiral. I pulled out my phone, thinking to document this strange vandalism, to have something concrete to show the head gardener tomorrow. The camera app opened without issue, but when I pressed record, something went wrong with the audio. Instead of capturing the ambient sounds of the greenhouse, the gentle hum of ventilation, the whisper of leaves, the microphone picked up only a deep, rhythmic thrumming. At first, I thought it was a malfunction, some interference from the building's electrical systems. But as I listened through the phone's speaker, I realized the sound was perfectly synchronized with something else. My own heartbeat. Each pulse of blood through my arteries corresponded exactly with the recorded rhythm, as if my phone had somehow learned to hear my circulatory system. I stopped the recording, my hands trembling slightly. When I played it back, the sound was there, clear and unmistakable. That steady, organic drumming that matched the nervous acceleration of my pulse. I recorded again, holding my breath, pressing my free hand against my chest to feel the rhythm of my heart. The phone captured it perfectly, that intimate sound that should have been inaudible to any external device. The humming outside had stopped. I hadn't noticed when it ceased, but the garden had fallen into a silence so complete that I could hear individual water drops striking the fountain's surface 40 yards away. The absence of sound felt more oppressive than any noise, a vacuum that seemed to press against my eardrums and make the greenhouse feel smaller, more confined. I needed air, space. The rational part of my mind demanded I lock up and leave, report the fingerprints through proper channels, let someone else investigate the strange audio phenomenon. But my feet carried me deeper into the garden instead, toward the orchard section where heritage apple trees cast intricate shadows across the pathways. The gate to the orchard stood slightly ajar. I knew I'd checked it that morning during my opening rounds. Every volunteer learned the routine: test each gate, ensure proper closure, maintain the garden's security. The orchard gate was one of the most important. It separated the public areas from the more delicate fruit trees that required careful monitoring. As I approached, the gate moved. Not a dramatic swing, nothing that could be attributed to wind or structural settling. Just a subtle shift, opening perhaps an inch wider, then closing back to its previous position. The hinges made no sound, but I felt the movement in my chest, a displacement of air that my body registered even when my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. I stood perfectly still, watching. The gate remained motionless for long enough that I began to question my perception. Then it happened again. Open, pause, close. The movement was so deliberate, so patient, that it seemed almost polite, like someone gently testing whether I was paying attention. The third time, the gate stayed open. Whatever rational voice had been whispering cautions in the back of my mind finally fell silent. I walked through the gateway, into the orchard's cool shadows, where apple trees heavy with late-season fruit created a cathedral of green light. The air here felt different, thicker, more attentive, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The humming returned, but closer now. Much closer. It seemed to rise from the trees themselves, from the dark earth between their roots, from the very air that moved through their leaves. The melody, and I could now distinguish it as a melody, though one I'd never heard before, wound around the tree trunks and through the hanging fruit with organic precision. It wasn't random wandering music, but something composed, something intentional. I followed the sound deeper into the orchard, past trees whose names I'd memorized during my volunteer training: winesap, northern spy, Rhode Island greening. The varieties planted here dated back over a century, their genetics preserved through careful cultivation, their roots extending far deeper than any modern fruit tree. They were living monuments, witnesses to decades of seasons, of visitors, of changes the garden had endured. Perhaps they remembered things. The thought appeared unbidden in my mind, and I tried to dismiss it as the kind of fanciful notion that isolation and stress could produce. But the idea took hold, growing stronger with each step deeper into the orchard. These trees had been here longer than the greenhouse, longer than most of the formal gardens, longer than anyone who currently worked here. They had watched generations of gardeners tend them, Visitors admire them. Seasons change around them. What if they remembered? The humming grew louder, and I realized I could almost make out words. Not clearly. They remained just beyond comprehension, like conversation heard through water or thick walls. But there was definitely a cadence there, a rhythm that suggested language rather than merely abstract melody. I pressed my ear against the rough bark of the nearest apple tree. The humming stopped instantly, but something else took its place. A sound like sap moving through wood, like cellular processes accelerated beyond normal perception. The tree was alive, profoundly alive, in ways I'd never considered. Its heartwood carried vibrations, information, signals that traveled from root to crown and back again in complex patterns. And somehow, those patterns were incorporating my presence. I could feel it learning my heartbeat, the rhythm of my breathing, the electrical impulses that governed my nervous system. The tree was reading me, integrating my biological signatures into its own ancient data stream. When I stepped back, the humming resumed, but now it contained something new, fragments of my own pattern woven into its mysterious melody. The sun had fallen behind the tree line while I explored, and the orchard was now deep in shadow. Evening brought different sounds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant hum of traffic crossing the Potomac bridges, the whisper of wind through leaves. But underneath these normal sounds, the humming continued, and I began to realize it had been there all along. I'd simply never been quiet enough to hear it. Walking back through the garden, I noticed things I'd missed during my months of volunteer work. The way certain pathways seemed to vibrate slightly underfoot, as if something large was moving just below the surface. The manner in which shadows fell between the hedges, creating patterns that looked almost like symbols when viewed from specific angles. The frequency with which visitors seemed to cluster in certain areas while unconsciously avoiding others. The garden was trying to communicate. This revelation should have felt ridiculous, a sign of mounting stress or isolation. Instead, it settled over me with the weight of absolute certainty. Every element of the landscape, the carefully planned sightlines, the strategic placement of plantings, the subtle elevation changes that guided foot traffic, had been designed not just for aesthetic appeal, but as components of some larger message. The original designers hadn't simply created a beautiful space. They had built a machine for storing and transmitting information across time. I unlocked my car in the visitor parking lot as the first stars became visible above the Potomac. My hands shook as I inserted the key, and I couldn't decide whether the trembling came from excitement or fear. The humming followed me even here, though fainter now, competing with the sounds of evening traffic and distant sirens. Tomorrow I would return. I would bring better recording equipment, take detailed photographs of the fingerprints, document everything with scientific precision. But even as I made these plans, I knew the evidence would prove inconclusive. The fingerprints would be gone, or they would have obvious explanations. The recordings would capture only ambient noise. The gates would remain properly closed. The garden would keep its secrets. As I drove away, checking the rearview mirror repeatedly, I saw the orchard gate swing open one final time. In the gathering darkness, a figure seemed to stand in the gateway. Tall, indistinct, patient, watching my departure with what might have been approval. When I looked again, the mirror showed only empty pathway and shadow, but the humming stayed with me all the way home, weaving through my thoughts like roots through soil, promising tomorrow's return, whispering of deeper mysteries waiting to be discovered in the space between earth and air, between memory and forgetting, between the garden's ancient knowledge and my growing need to understand. The Potomac flowed past my window, dark water carrying its own secrets toward the bay, and somewhere in its rhythm I could hear an echo of that tuneless melody, as if the river itself was humming along with whatever lived and remembered in those carefully tended grounds. I would go back. I had to go back. The garden wouldn't let me stay away.